Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The night I'm about to describe made me question everything. I thought I knew about working alone in a quiet industrial depot. It started as a regular shift, with the usual routine checks and a lot of empty time. By the end of that shift, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It still gets my pulse going when I talk about it. I work as a night watchman in a small building supply depot. It's about the size of a medium warehouse, with rows of shelves, a little office up front, and a big loading area in the back. There's one main gate where trucks come and go during the day. There's a side door, what we call the service door, normally used for deliveries or staff who need a quick exit. At night, I'm the only one there. I clock in around sunset. Usually the place is dead quiet by the time I finish my first patrol. There are some humming lights, distant traffic from a nearby freeway, and a couple of stray cats that sometimes dart around outside. But other than that, it's just me. I'm on my own from dusk until early morning. My boss leaves a list of tasks. Lock up, keep an eye on the stock, walk around once every hour, make sure there's no theft or trespassing. It's simple work most nights. I walk, I check. I come back to the small security station, which is basically a corner with a tiny desk, an old office chair, and a space heater that sometimes works. I have a kettle for coffee, a stack of magazines, and a notepad for writing down anything that needs to be reported the next morning. That particular night started like any other. I arrived around 9 p.m. My boss handed me the keys, reminded me to check the newly stacked pallets in the back, and left around 9:30. I locked the main gate after his car drove off, then took a quick look inside the depot to see if anyone was still hanging around. The place was empty. The only lights left on were the overhead fluorescents. They sometimes flicker, but it's just old wiring. I thought nothing of it. Around 10 p.m. I did my first patrol. I started at the front office, walked through each aisle, checked all the supply shelves, the storage racks, and the tool section. Everything seemed in order. I locked the service door, which was shut at the time, and made sure the padlock on it was secured. Then I circled back to my station. The air was dry, and my throat felt scratchy. I remember I took a quick sip of water. I wrote "all clear" in my notepad. I sat down, leaned back, and tried not to nod off. The fluorescent lights in my station buzzed. I could hear the buzz more than usual. The building was so quiet that even the hum of the lights seemed loud. My ears were kind of tuned in to every small noise after a while. I checked my phone for messages, but there was nothing. I scrolled through some social media apps, glanced at my watch, and realized it was almost 11 p.m. I got up to do my second patrol. I walked down the central aisle. There were no windows in this part of the warehouse, so it felt enclosed. My footsteps echoed on the concrete floor. My flashlight beam cut through the dimmer areas, though the overhead lights were still on. Everything looked normal at first. Then I noticed the service door was slightly open, just a crack, but it was definitely not locked. I pushed the door to see if maybe the latch was broken. It clicked shut like it was fine. The padlock was still on the handle, but it was hanging loose. I remember frowning and thinking, I know I locked this. I locked it again, tested the door, and it held. I walked outside for a second and checked the perimeter. The night air was cold. My breath hung in front of me. There wasn't anyone around. No suspicious cars. No movement in the alley. So I went back inside. I decided that maybe I hadn't engaged the lock all the way before. It's easy to make a mistake when you do the same routine every day. I finished that patrol around 11:10. When I got back to my desk, I wrote a note. Service door was open slightly, secured again. I felt a little uneasy, but I pushed it aside. These things happen. Sometimes employees jam the lock or someone forgets to align the latch properly. I told myself not to worry. By midnight, I was flipping through a magazine. The building seemed quiet again. Around 12:30, I heard what I thought was a light clicking noise from somewhere near the back. My body tensed up. I stood and grabbed my flashlight. The noise stopped. I listened for another minute, but I heard nothing else. I decided it might be just the water pipes or the old ventilation system. I told myself I was overthinking it. A bit after 1 a.m., the lights in the far corner started flickering. The overhead bulbs there would blink a few times, then go back to steady light, then blink again. The depot's electrical wiring wasn't in the best shape, so normally I'd assume it was a loose connection. But something about the flicker made my skin prickle. It felt different, like someone was messing with the switch. I walked over to that area, shining my flashlight up at the fixtures. They were out of my reach. I couldn't do anything about it except tap the wall switch. That didn't fix it. The flickering slowed, but didn't stop. I wrote it down in my notepad and started heading back to my station. I reached an aisle with tool racks on both sides. The shelves were about 8 feet tall, stacked with power tools, toolboxes, and hardware. As I walked past them, I heard soft footsteps. They echoed off the concrete floor. I froze and listened. The steps sounded slow, like someone was being careful not to make noise. My heart pounded. I held my flashlight in front of me, shining the beam between the shelves. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer. My hands felt sweaty. I stepped closer to the middle of the aisle. I scanned left and right. I didn't see anyone. I checked the gate from a distance, still shut and locked. I made my way to the end of the aisle and looked around the corner. Nothing there. I started to think maybe I heard my own echo. The place can play tricks on you if you're tired. I went back to my desk, feeling my pulse in my neck. I tried to calm down. I sat there, tapped my foot a few times, and thought, if there is someone inside, I'll catch them on my next round. The security cameras weren't exactly high-end. They covered the outside gate and the front door, but not the interior. My boss said cameras inside the building were too expensive. That left me as the only set of eyes after hours. At around 2 a.m., I heard a faint thumping noise. It sounded like it came from outside near the main gate. My stomach tightened. I got up, took my flashlight, and moved carefully toward the front. The gate has a small window set into it. Usually you can see through it if there's enough light. But at that moment, I didn't see any movement. Then the gate rattled. It shook like someone was pressing or pulling on it from the outside. My mouth went dry. I tried to peer through the window again. Nobody was there. "Who's out there?" I yelled, pressing my hand against the metal. The rattling stopped. I heard a sound that might have been breathing, or maybe just the wind. I unlatched the gate, opened at a crack, and looked out into the empty parking area. The asphalt was lit by a single streetlight. There wasn't a car or person in sight. My breath felt loud in my ears. I stepped all the way outside, looking left and right. I didn't see anyone trying to hide. The fence was tall, topped with barbed wire. It would be hard to climb without making a lot of noise. I locked the gate again and went back inside. As I walked through the main entrance, I noticed my legs felt shaky. My heart was pounding, and my palms were sweaty. I sat down for a moment, trying to gather myself. I asked myself if this could be some random prank, but it felt too strange. We never got foot traffic out there at that hour. The entire industrial area was basically a ghost town at night. I still had a few hours left on my shift. I decided to stay extra alert. I turned off the small space heater, thinking maybe silence would help me hear better if something else happened. The overhead buzzing lights seemed louder than ever. I kept glancing at the clock, wanting the night to end. At around 3 a.m., I got up for another patrol. I walked slowly, checking every aisle. I tested each door again. The service door was locked. The main gate was locked. Everything was secured, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My scalp felt tingly, and I caught myself looking over my shoulder more than once. I heard a faint tapping sound near the shelves with the power tools. I turned my flashlight there, but nothing moved. I stood still for a moment, listening. My own breathing sounded loud. Then the tapping noise stopped. I looked at my watch. It was 3:30. In 3 more hours, the morning supervisor would arrive. I told myself I could handle it until then. I went back to my station but didn't sit. My body felt too tense. I kept shifting my weight from one foot to the other. The place was silent, except for that occasional flicker from the far corner. I grabbed a cup of water and sipped it. My mouth was dry again. Suddenly, the gate rattled for the second time. The metal clanged like someone yanked it hard. I rushed over, flashlight in hand, heart pounding. I flicked on the overhead light near the entrance. Nothing was there. I felt my pulse hammering. The steel door looked like it had been hit from the outside. I heard my voice shaking when I said, "If you're out there, you better leave now." Silence. I opened it a crack to check outside. The parking lot was still empty. The street lamp flickered. The sky was dark. My ears were ringing from all the adrenaline. I closed and locked the gate. I took a deep breath, rubbed my forehead, and tried to think. Could it be an animal? Maybe a stray dog or something nudging the gate. But it sounded more forceful than that. I checked the time again. Almost 4 a.m. 2 more hours. I kept telling myself to just power through. I decided to patrol every 30 minutes instead of every hour. I moved up and down the aisles, shining my flashlight under shelves and behind pallets. The flickering lights in the corner had settled down, but the silence felt heavier than ever. I sniffed the air, thinking I might smell something off if someone had broken in, but the only smell was dust and old concrete. Around 4:30, I was standing in the tool aisle when I heard footsteps again. They sounded deliberate, as if someone took 2 or 3 steps and then stopped. I felt the hair on my neck stand up. I spun around, shining my flashlight. Nothing. My breathing got shallow. My eyes watered from not blinking enough. Every sense was on high alert. I didn't call out this time. I just stood there, waiting to see if I'd catch a glimpse of a person. No one appeared. I noticed my hands shaking a bit, so I clenched them. I walked back toward my station, my legs feeling heavy. Every so often, I'd flick my flashlight behind me. Nothing moved. When I arrived at my desk, I set the flashlight down and rubbed my temples. My head hurt. I wrote another note. Heard footsteps in tool aisle again. No sign of entry. I tapped my pen on the desk, counting the minutes until 5 a.m. At 5:15, I was near the service door for a final check. The padlock was still in place. Then I heard a metallic clang from the back area. It was loud enough to make me jump. I ran toward the sound, my flashlight bobbing. I reached the pallet racks. A small metal bucket had fallen from a stack. It rolled in circles on the floor, making a loud scraping noise. No one was there to knock it over. The shelf was stable. I looked around, my ears buzzing with adrenaline. I kicked the bucket to the side and looked up at the racks. Nothing was loose. I felt the blood pounding in my head. My chest felt tight. I spent the last half hour of my shift pacing near the front entrance and checking behind me. I couldn't relax. The vibrations in the metal gate didn't come back, and I didn't hear more footsteps. But the tension stayed in my body. I checked the clock over and over until I saw 6 a.m. That's when the morning supervisor usually arrives. By 6:10, my boss's car pulled up. I felt a wave of relief. I unlocked the gate, let him in, and handed over my notes. I explained that I'd heard noises, found the service door open, and felt like someone had tried to get in. He looked around and didn't find signs of a break-in. No missing items, no damaged locks. He shrugged and said he'd have someone check the wiring and the locks. He told me to go home and get some rest. I left the depot that morning feeling drained. My shirt was damp with sweat, and my legs ached from tension. I didn't have any concrete explanation for what happened. I knew what I heard. I saw that service door open. I felt the gate rattle more than once, but there was no person in sight. It was like I was being pushed to the edge all night by something unseen. I never found out if it was a prank or a person or something else. That shift ended, but the uneasy feeling stuck with me for days. Even now, I think about that night whenever I pass the building supply depot after dark. I still work there, but I take extra precautions. I double-check every door, every latch, every padlock. I listen more carefully during my rounds. Nothing like that has happened since. but I haven't stopped looking over my shoulder. I haven't stopped wondering who or what was trying to get in that night, and every time I think of the rattling gate, my heart races all over again. I still feel a tightness in my chest when I think about that night. It happened a few years ago when I was working on a project in the computer lab at my college. I needed more time to wrap everything up, so I stayed behind long after everyone else left. I didn't see anyone around when I got there late in the evening, and I assumed I would be alone until morning. Most students went home hours earlier, and the cleaning staff usually finished by midnight. I figured I'd be safe to work without interruptions. I never expected the sense of unease that crept over me or the strange sounds I heard. It might have been nothing, but it felt real enough to send shivers down my spine. I'd never experienced anything quite like it before, and to this day I wonder if someone else was there that night. I arrived at the lab around 10 o'clock in the evening. The hallway lights were on, but the corridors felt empty. My footsteps echoed when I walked. I remember hearing a slight hum from the fluorescent lights on the ceiling. The air felt a bit cool because the building's ventilation system was still running. I stepped into the computer lab and flicked on the overhead lights. Rows of computers stood in neat lines. No one was in the room. I could see a few cleaning carts stationed outside in the hallway, but I didn't see any cleaning staff. I guess they were probably on another floor. I settled into one of the chairs in the back row because I liked the privacy, and I started working right away. For the next few hours, I focused on my project. I had a programming assignment due soon, and I was struggling with some bugs in the code. I typed, clicked, and stared at the screen, trying different solutions. Occasionally, I'd hear a soft clang from somewhere in the building, maybe a door shutting or some ventilation knocking around. It was never loud enough to distract me completely, but it kept me aware that I wasn't home. I liked the quiet, though. I found it easier to concentrate without people around. My eyes felt tired, but I pushed myself to keep going. I planned to finish the project that night so I wouldn't have to worry about it over the weekend. Around midnight, I got up to stretch my legs. I walked around the lab. The lights flickered slightly, the way fluorescent lights sometimes do. I didn't think much of it. I drank some water from a dispenser in the corner and glanced out into the hallway. The corridor was still lit, but I saw no movement. I heard no voices, no footsteps, nothing that suggested anyone was near. I figured the cleaning staff had finished their work and left. I went back to my seat and kept working. Time passed, and I got really absorbed in what I was doing. I lost track of how long I had been typing. At one point, I looked at my watch. It was almost 2 in the morning. My neck felt stiff, my eyes were dry. I decided it was time to wrap up. I saved my files on a USB drive, closed out the project, and began transferring some notes to my email. The lab felt extra quiet at that hour. The air conditioning made a low humming sound. My desk lamp was the only light I had on because I had turned off the main lights to focus on the screen. The desk lamp created a small circle of brightness around me. The rest of the room was dim. That was when I felt an odd sensation on the back of my neck, like something brushed against me or like someone was standing right behind me. My first reaction was to freeze. I sat there, not moving, and let my eyes shift to the corners of the room. I couldn't see anyone. The door to the lab was in my peripheral vision, and it was still closed. I didn't hear it open. I told myself it was just my nerves. Maybe I was too tired. I shook my shoulders to loosen up the tension and took a slow breath. Then I resumed logging off the computer. I tried to act normal, but my heart was beating faster. A few seconds later, I thought I heard something in the hallway. At first, it was faint, like the echo of steps on the tile floor. I paused and listened. The sound grew a bit louder. They were footsteps, moving slowly, like someone was wandering around. At that time of night, it was unlikely anyone else would be walking those corridors. A security guard might do rounds, but they usually carried keys or walkie-talkies that made noise. I didn't hear any jingling or static, just the distinct tapping of shoes against the floor, spaced out in a measured pace. I glanced at the door again. It had a small rectangular window. Light spilled in from the hallway. I couldn't see anybody pass by the door. The footsteps sounded closer, then suddenly stopped. I stared at the door for a moment longer. No one appeared. I started to feel a tightening in my stomach. My heart was still racing. I stood up, grabbed my backpack, and decided it was time to leave. My files were already saved, so I shut down the computer. I reached over to turn off the desk lamp. The room went dark, except for the soft glow from the exit sign on the wall. I walked to the door and flipped the switch to shut off the overhead lights in the lab. The corridor lights were still on, so I could see out there. I stood for a second in the doorway, trying to figure out if anyone was around. I didn't hear more footsteps. The hallway looked empty in both directions. I felt uneasy, but I couldn't identify what was bothering me. Maybe I just didn't like the idea of being alone in a big building at 2 in the morning. It's not something I did often, and the silence was getting to me. I stepped into the hallway and headed toward the stairwell that led to the main entrance. My plan was to go straight home. I passed some classrooms with their doors closed. The windows were dark inside. I tried to keep my footsteps quiet. Halfway to the stairwell, I realized I was thirsty again. The water fountain was near the emergency stairwell, so I decided to stop there briefly. As I approached the water fountain, I heard a faint scraping sound. I paused. It seemed to be coming from the doorway to the emergency stairs. The door was slightly ajar, and the metal edge rubbed against the floor as it moved, creating a soft scraping noise. I walked closer, my pulse pounding in my ears. I could see the door in front of me, maybe a few inches open. The stairwell beyond looked dark. Usually those stairwells have motion-activated lights, but they were off. That meant no one had walked through recently, at least not in the last minute or two. But the door was open enough to make me wonder who had gone in there. I leaned forward a bit, still a couple of feet away. I couldn't see anything but darkness. My eyes tried to adjust, but there was almost no light inside. I sensed a slight movement like a shift in the shadows, but I couldn't be sure. My imagination might have been running wild. A wave of adrenaline rushed through me. My hands felt clammy. My backpack strap dug into my shoulder. I wanted to get out of there. At the same time, I felt a strange urge to peek inside. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe I thought someone could be hurt or hiding. But that thought freaked me out even more because I had no idea what I would find. If it was a staff member, they would have turned on the lights or closed the door. If it was security, they would have announced themselves or left the door closed after going in. This was different. I reached out a hand to push the door open a bit more, but I pulled back. My instincts screamed at me not to do it. My heart was hammering, and the hallway felt too quiet. I imagined the door swinging all the way open to reveal an empty staircase or something worse. My throat felt dry, and I almost forgot I was thirsty. I stepped toward the water fountain, pressed the button, and took a quick gulp. The water was cold, and for a second, it grounded me. I stood up straight, wiped my mouth, and looked at that stairwell door again. It was still open just enough to show darkness inside. I heard no more scraping, no more movement. I felt this strong urge to run. My muscles felt tense. My ears were tuned to any sound. The hum of the building's ventilation felt louder than before. I heard my own pulse in my ears. I decided to walk away. I didn't want to investigate. Nothing about this situation felt right. So I tightened my grip on my backpack straps and started moving down the corridor. My steps were brisk. My eyes flicked over my shoulder a few times, but I didn't see anyone behind me. When I finally reached the main stairwell that leads down to the exit, I breathed a slight sigh of relief. Those stairs were lit, and I felt safer when I saw the normal lighting there. I descended the steps quickly, each footstep echoing off the concrete walls. I glanced behind me once or twice, but I didn't see anyone following. I made it to the ground floor and saw the security desk near the main entrance. Nobody was there. It was a small booth with a phone and a sign-in sheet. The lights were on, but no guard was in sight. Sometimes the guards make rounds outside checking the parking lot. I didn't want to wait for them. I pushed through the glass doors and stepped into the cool night air. The parking lot felt empty. A few lights shone on the asphalt. My car was parked near a lamppost, and it was the only vehicle in that row. My footsteps sounded loud against the pavement. My breath was uneven. I kept looking around, expecting to see a janitor or maybe a security officer. No one showed up. I clicked the unlock button on my key fob and got into my car. I locked the doors and turned the ignition. For a few seconds, I sat there glancing at the building, half expecting a silhouette at one of the windows. I saw nothing. The place looked deserted. The only movement was the faint flicker of a streetlight on the far side of the lot. I pulled out and drove away, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror. My mind replayed what happened in the hallway, the open door, the footsteps. I wondered if I should have told security that something weird was going on up there. But I also felt silly. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe a breeze pushed the door open. Or maybe an employee was in the stairwell and didn't realize the door stayed ajar. My gut told me it was something else, though. The footsteps sounded too deliberate. The feeling on the back of my neck felt too distinct to ignore. My skin had crawled, and that wasn't normal for me. When I got home, I felt a mix of relief and tension. My apartment was quiet. I double-checked the locks on my door, which I normally never did. My mind was still racing. I sat down on my couch and tried to calm myself. I told myself it was just a random experience. Maybe I was just exhausted and paranoid. But then I remembered how I felt in the lab, how sudden that chill was, like someone hovering behind me. And I recalled the exact rhythm of those footsteps. They didn't sound hurried. They sounded measured, almost cautious. That's what unnerved me most. It was like whoever was walking didn't want to be heard, yet I heard them. I considered calling a friend or sending someone a text, but it was too late, and I didn't want to freak anyone out. I decided to shake it off and go to bed. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that dark stairwell door. I kept picturing it open just a crack, with darkness beyond, and the sense that someone stood there, watching. The next day, I mentioned it to one classmate. He shrugged it off and said it was probably a custodian or a random security guard checking corners. That explanation seemed plausible, but it didn't fully ease my mind. I never found out for sure who was there. I know the building has a few security cameras in the main corridors, but I never went to check the footage. I felt too embarrassed to ask. Part of me didn't want to know. I finished my project and avoided staying that late in the lab from then on. If I had to work at night, I made sure to leave by midnight when more people were still around. To this day, when I think about that night, I feel the same unease creeping back into my chest. I remember the cold water from the fountain, the dim lights in the corridor, and the door scraping against the floor. I recall the sound of those footsteps coming closer, then stopping. I can still feel that electric jolt in my body when I sensed someone behind me in the lab. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was something, but it was enough to make me walk away fast without a single glance over my shoulder when I left. I didn't want to know who or what lurked in that stairwell. I'm not sure if I was alone in that building, and I still wonder if someone else was watching me from the darkness, waiting for me to leave. I agreed to look after my friend's place, thinking it would be a relaxing break from my usual routine. I pictured quiet nights, fresh air, and maybe a chance to clear my head. It was a simple job. Feed the couple of animals he had, keep an eye on the house, and make sure nothing got stolen. I didn't expect to lose sleep. I didn't expect to feel trapped inside a small house in the middle of nowhere, jumping at every sound. But that's exactly what happened. When I arrived, the drive from the main road took me along a narrow dirt track with thick brush on both sides. The house was small and sat on a bit of cleared land at the center of the property. A modest fence surrounded the backyard, and beyond that was more forest. My friend mentioned the place was peaceful but isolated. The way he put it was, you might not see another person for days. I shrugged at the time. I actually liked the idea. I'd been under a lot of stress, and being alone in nature seemed like a good deal. The first afternoon was calm. I carried my bag inside, checked the rooms, and placed my things in the small bedroom. The house had a main living room, a connected kitchen area, one bathroom, and a back door that opened onto a tiny porch. The place smelled a bit musty, like it hadn't been aired out in a while. I opened some windows to let in fresh air and sunshine. Outside, there was a short clothesline, a little tool shed, and a small pen for a few chickens. My friend said to feed them once a day. There were only 3. They clucked at me when I passed by, but they didn't need much attention. I spent most of the afternoon unpacking and familiarizing myself with the house. The front door had a sturdy lock. The back door also had a decent lock and a simple metal latch. All the windows were normal size. A couple of them had screens with tiny tiers, but I didn't think much of that at the time. I was more interested in making sure the water heater worked and the electricity was reliable. Everything seemed in order. By the time the sun started dipping behind the trees, I realized how quiet it was out there. No traffic noise, no voices, just an occasional rustle in the leaves if a breeze passed through. Around 6 in the evening, I decided to heat a can of soup and make a quick sandwich. The kitchen was small but functional. After I ate, I wandered around outside, checking the shed. It had some basic tools, a shovel, a couple of rakes, and some spare planks of wood. I stood by the fence for a while. The forest looked dense and the trees blocked most of the light once the sun sank lower. When full darkness hit, I went back inside. I turned on the lights in the living room and tried to watch something on my laptop. There wasn't much of a signal, so streaming was out of the question. I settled for some offline videos I had saved. The quiet around me felt heavier after a couple of hours. I could hear insects buzzing and an occasional chirp from somewhere outside. The house made small creaks, maybe from temperature changes or just old wood. I told myself it was normal for a place like this. Around 10, I felt tired and decided to turn in. I locked both doors carefully, tested the knobs, then headed to bed. The bedroom light had a weak bulb that flickered a bit before settling. I remember feeling a slight chill, even though it wasn't cold outside. I cracked the window open for air, and I could see only darkness beyond. I got under the covers and shut my eyes, telling myself I would sleep well. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. My phone showed it was 2 in the morning. At first, I thought I heard an animal rustling outside, maybe a stray dog or raccoon. But then I noticed a faint scraping noise on glass. It was soft and high-pitched, like a branch or claw dragging along a surface. I sat up. The sound came from the window near the foot of my bed. My chest felt tight and my heart started pounding. I listened for a good few seconds, not sure if I should move. I turned on the bedside lamp and stared at the window. The blinds were up, so I saw the reflection of the lamp on the glass. The scraping noise stopped. I swung my legs out of bed, walked over, and carefully peeked out. All I saw was the silhouette of trees. No movement, no figure, nothing unusual. I told myself it was probably a branch in the wind, although there wasn't much wind. I slid the window shut, locked it, and stood there. My body felt tense, and I realized I was holding my breath. I forced myself to exhale and calm down. I went back to bed, but I kept the lamp on. I listened for more sounds. After half an hour, I heard nothing else, so I turned off the light and managed to sleep. The next morning, I woke up around 8. My body felt tired, like I hadn't rested well. I got dressed, made coffee, and walked outside to check on the chickens. The day was clear, and the air smelled fresh. It helped ease some of the tension I still felt. I scattered feed for the chickens, and they seemed fine. Then I wandered around the house to see if there were any branches near the windows that could have caused that noise. I didn't see any branches close enough. But something else caught my eye near the windows outside the living room. Footprints in the mud. They were shaped like human footprints without any sign of shoes. The toes and heels were clearly outlined in the dried soil. I stood there for a moment, trying to figure out who would walk around the property barefoot at night. I bent down and touched the ground. The soil was a bit moist, but not soft enough to capture deep prints unless there was decent pressure. These prints looked fresh. My stomach knotted when I realized they were right below the window. I followed them for a short distance. They seemed to trail toward the edge of the backyard fence and then vanished. Maybe they continued into the forest, but I couldn't see any more impressions among the leaves and grass. I told myself it could be a local person who wanders around. Some people in rural areas do go barefoot, especially if they live nearby. Still, it felt odd. I decided to keep a closer watch that day. I finished my coffee inside, but my eyes kept drifting to the windows. I double-checked the locks again. Then I spent the afternoon exploring more of the property. I stuck to the cleared areas, not wanting to get lost. I found a small creek on the northern side, hidden by thick vegetation. The water looked shallow and calm. I also noticed old fence posts that seemed to mark the boundary of my friend's land. By late afternoon, I was sweaty and covered in a few scratches from pushing past branches. I headed back to the house for a shower. The second night, I made a simple pasta dinner and tried to relax in the living room. The night sounds outside felt louder now that I was on edge. I tried to focus on a magazine, flipping through pages without really reading. Around 11, I locked everything up again and left one light on in the hallway. I headed to bed, determined to get some sleep. But around 2 in the morning, I heard that scraping noise again. This time, it came from near the back door. My eyes shot open. Adrenaline hit me so fast that my legs tingled. I slipped out of bed and grabbed my phone. Part of me wanted to call my friend, but I knew he was out of town on business. I crept down the hallway, heart pounding against my chest. The house was so quiet that every step I took on the wooden floor seemed louder than normal. When I reached the kitchen, I heard another faint scraping sound, like something brushing against metal. It was coming from the back door latch. I swallowed hard. My mouth felt dry. I switched on the kitchen light and yanked the door open. The porch light wasn't very bright, but I could see enough to notice that no one stood there. The yard was empty, just the fence and the trees beyond. I looked down. The latch on the outside of the door had small scratches on it, like someone had run a sharp object along its surface. A chill washed over me. I stepped onto the porch and scanned the area. Nothing. I locked the door again, then stood there with my hand still on the knob, listening to my own breathing. I didn't feel safe. I walked through the house, checking each window. Everything was locked, and the curtains were drawn in the living room. My hands were shaking. I tried to calm down by telling myself it might just be an animal clawing at the door, but the prints from earlier suggested someone was actually walking around barefoot. That thought made my pulse race again. I ended up turning on a light in the living room and leaving it on all night. I dozed off in an armchair, but it was restless sleep. Every tiny creak or rustle made me jerk awake. I kept imagining someone staring at me from outside, waiting for me to drift off. By dawn, I felt exhausted and jumpy. My body ached from sleeping in that chair. That morning, I decided to walk the perimeter again. I noticed more footprints by the back porch steps. They were smeared as if someone had slid a bit on the damp ground. I couldn't trace them far. They disappeared into the grass near the fence. I went to the front, looked around, and saw nothing else. I spent the rest of the day feeling uneasy. I tried to keep busy, but it was hard to focus. The isolation that once sounded appealing now felt oppressive. I felt like I was in a bubble, cut off from help. That third evening, I grilled a piece of chicken on an old charcoal grill my friend kept in the backyard. I kept checking over my shoulder. The forest looked darker than usual, though that was probably just my imagination. By the time I finished eating, it was almost completely dark. I decided to head inside, double-check the locks, and maybe stay awake until I couldn't keep my eyes open anymore. I put a chair against the back doorknob, just in case. I tried to watch some downloaded videos again, but I couldn't concentrate. My eyes kept darting to the windows. I went to bed around midnight, but I left the living room light on and the bedroom door open. For a while, I lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for a sound. My body felt tense, as if I was bracing for impact. Eventually, I drifted off. At around 2 in the morning, I woke with a start. I heard something like a soft thump against the side of the house. Then silence. I lay still, my heart thudding in my chest. I didn't hear the scraping this time, just that single thump. I waited, clutching my phone. After a few minutes of silence, I got up and walked slowly to the living room. I flipped on the outside light, peered through the curtains. Nothing moved. The fence line looked still. I didn't open the door. Instead, I stood there for what felt like forever, listening for any hint of movement. Nothing happened. That final day, I woke up feeling relieved that I'd be leaving soon. My friend would return the next morning, but I planned to drive back home before that. I felt no urge to spend another night there. I packed my things, tidied the place, and fed the chickens one last time. Around noon, I made a final round of the yard. I didn't see any fresh footprints. The day felt hot, the sky clear. I kept glancing toward the tree line, half expecting someone to appear. Nobody did. I locked up the house, made sure the doors were secure, and threw my bag into the passenger seat of my car. Before I got in, I took one last look at the property. The old fence, the silent house, the thick woods. It looked normal, almost serene in the midday sun. But I couldn't shake that uneasy feeling. I started the car, reversed down the dirt path, and left. I don't know who was lurking around those nights. Maybe it was a nearby resident who wandered onto the land. Maybe they were testing the locks for some reason. I have no clue. All I know is that my time there wasn't peaceful. I spent more energy trying to stay calm than I did relaxing. By the time I got home, I was relieved to be back in a neighborhood with streetlights and neighbors. My friend texted me later, thanking me for watching his place. I told him everything was fine, which was true on paper. Nothing was stolen, no damage besides some scratched paint. But if he ever asks me to watch his property again, I'll probably pass. I'm not interested in spending another night out there alone, listening to those strange scraping sounds at 2 a.m. I still remember that night because it felt wrong from the start. My shift had run late 1,000 times before, but I never felt that creeping pressure behind my eyes like I did then. I walked into the old lobby around 10:30, saw the security guard nod at me, and headed straight for the elevator. I carried my laptop bag over one shoulder and a thermos of coffee in my other hand. My body felt tense, and my legs dragged with each step. I wanted to finish my work and go home. I didn't realize how strange things would get in just a couple of hours. My name is Marcus. I work as IT support for a small company on the 8th floor of an old commercial building. The building's over 50 years old, and it shows in the cracked tiles, flickering lights, and creaky elevator. That night, I needed to double-check our servers and make sure there were no leftover problems from a software update. I had to stay late because part of my job involves handling any crisis outside normal hours. If something breaks at 11 p.m., I'm the one who gets the call. When I arrived, I noticed the building was quiet. No one else was in the lobby except the security guard, Paolo. He sat at his desk under a fluorescent lamp. He looked tired, with his uniform wrinkled at the sleeves. I asked him if anybody else was around, and he said, "No, you're the last one here. I just saw the last tenant leave about half an hour ago." He kept his hand near the phone on his desk, which was normal for him. I told him I'd be upstairs if he needed me, and I headed to the elevator. The elevator ride was slow, like always. I could hear the cables squeaking as I went up. The overhead light flickered twice before settling into a low hum. My head started to ache. I felt a little anxious, but I tried to ignore it. I told myself, I just want to get this done and go home. When the doors opened on the 8th floor, the hallway was dark. The sensor-controlled lights took a moment to come on, and I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the elevator doors. I looked tired, bags under my eyes, hair messed up from a full day of running around. My shirt felt damp under my arms. I walked to our office and unlocked the main door. It was a small space with about 5 desks, a few computer stations, and a separate room for the server. It smelled stale because nobody had opened a window all day. The air conditioning had been off since late afternoon, so the temperature in the office hovered somewhere around stuffy. I turned on only one set of overhead lights to keep things calm. Usually, I prefer bright lights, but something made me want low lighting that night. I was already tense, and I felt like anything too bright would just make my headache worse. I sat down at my desk and booted up the main computer. It took a while to load because I had some scripts running in the background. I opened my thermos and sipped some coffee, but it tasted metallic and lukewarm. I tried to focus on the server logs. The clock on the screen showed 10:48 p.m. I typed away, checking for errors. I heard the hum of the air vents and the soft whir of the server's cooling fans in the next room. Occasionally, I heard the old building pipes groan. They do that sometimes when the temperature changes. About 30 minutes later, right when I was wrapping up my first scan of the logs, I heard the doorbell ring. There's a service door on the other side of our office that connects to a maintenance hallway. Hardly anyone uses it at night. It has a loud, buzzing doorbell. That sound cut through the silence, and I jumped in my seat. My pulse sped up. I rubbed my eyes and looked at the security monitor on my desk. The feed showed the hallway outside the service door. It was empty. I squinted, thinking maybe the camera was glitching. It's an old camera, so sometimes you see flickers or dead spots, but it looked perfectly clear. Just an empty hallway with the dim light near the stairwell. I picked up the phone and called Paulo downstairs. He answered with a short, "Yeah?" And I told him about the doorbell. He said he hadn't seen anyone go up. He sounded annoyed, but also curious. He told me, "I didn't see anything on my screens either. Maybe it's a short circuit." I shrugged, even though he couldn't see me. I set the phone down, got up, and walked to the service door. I looked through the peephole. Nothing. The hallway was still. The faint hum of the building's ventilation filled my ears. My neck felt hot, and I took a deep breath. I told myself it was probably a wiring issue. I went back to my desk, tried to refocus on the server logs, and told myself I would check the wiring later. 10 minutes passed. I actually started to forget about the doorbell. I was halfway through updating some configurations when it rang again. That same grating buzzer. The hairs on my arms stood up. I muttered, "What the hell?" and pushed my chair away from the desk. I opened the camera feed one more time. Nothing. The hallway looked empty again. This time, I got up right away, walked to the service door, and opened it. I stuck my head out. The corridor light was on. No movement. The door leading to the stairwell was shut. My footsteps echoed on the tiled floor as I stepped out. I looked left, then right. I didn't see any shadows or hear anything except a faint drip from somewhere down the hall. There was a slight musty smell, like mold. My stomach felt tight, and I wanted to get out of there. So I went back inside, closed the door, and locked it. I told myself it had to be an electrical glitch. At about 11:20, I decided I was done with most of my checks. I started packing up. I felt a little uneasy, but not terrified. I just wanted to leave. Then out of nowhere, a crackling noise came from my computer speakers. It sounded like static at first, a faint hiss that rose and fell. I froze in place, my bag half zipped, and stared at the speakers. My heart thumped in my chest. The noise got louder. It sounded like a broken radio signal. Then, underneath the static, I thought I heard a voice. It wasn't clear. It was like a distant whisper, maybe a word or two, but too garbled to make sense. My throat went dry. I leaned closer to the speaker. I couldn't pick out any actual words, but the tone sounded off. It made my skin prickle, like hearing someone talk from another room when you know you're alone. I reached behind the monitor and pulled the power cable out. The screen went black. The static still came through the speakers for a second, then stopped. I sat there, my hands shaking a little. I rubbed my palms on my pants. My brain raced. Maybe some frequency interference was crossing through the wires. Maybe it was a glitch from the building's old wiring. Either way, I just wanted to turn everything off and go. I headed to the main breaker room at the back of the office. I flipped the switch for our floor's power. That killed the lights, computers, everything. Darkness washed over the place, and the only glow came from the emergency exit signs in the hallway. My breathing felt shallow. I forced myself to stay calm. Okay, that should handle it, I thought. I walked back to my desk, grabbed my laptop bag, and used my phone's flashlight to guide me around. No more static, no more weird noises. I felt relief. The tension in my shoulders loosened a bit. I took the elevator down to the lobby. The ride was slow, and I caught a reflection of myself in the shiny interior. My eyes looked wide, alert. My neck felt stiff, and my heart still beat faster than normal. When I stepped out, Paulo was standing near the elevator doors. He looked puzzled. He asked me if everything was okay. I nodded, but I noticed he kept glancing at the corridor that led to some of the other offices on the first floor. I asked him what happened. He said he saw lights flickering in the hallway upstairs after I supposedly cut the power. He pointed to his monitor. It showed a feed from the 8th floor corridor. It was dark, with occasional static lines. He swore he saw lights flash on and off in that feed for a few seconds. Then the camera went black. He shrugged and said, "Could be the building's old system messing up, but it felt weird." I felt my stomach knot up again. I told him about the doorbell and the static on the speakers. He listened with his arms crossed. He rubbed his forehead and muttered something about how this building needed a serious upgrade. He also looked worried. We both stared at the lobby entrance for a moment. Nobody came in or out. The only sound was the faint buzz from the overhead light. I noticed the clock on the wall. It was a little past midnight by now. We stood there, not sure what to do next. Paulo offered to check the 8th floor with me, but I said no. I was done for the night. I told him I wanted to head home, that we could look into the electrical issues in the morning. He nodded, though he looked uneasy. Before I left, I opened the door to the street. A rush of cool night air hit my face. It felt like a release after the stale air upstairs. I stepped outside, said goodbye to Paulo, and let the door close behind me. I just wanted to forget everything. The next day, I came in early. I felt tired, like I hadn't slept well. My mind kept replaying the static in the empty hallway. I tried to push it aside. The building was busier in the morning. People bustled around. The smell of coffee filled the lobby, and I saw the cleaning staff vacuuming the floors. The whole place felt normal again. I rode the elevator with a few co-workers who had no idea about my night. They chatted about routine stuff, oblivious to the fact that something strange had happened hours before. When I reached our office, I checked the breaker. It was still off. I flipped it on and powered up the main systems. Everything booted normally, no sign of damage or short circuits. I did a quick check of the doorbell wiring at the service door. Nothing looked frayed or loose. I tested the doorbell. It worked fine. No random rings, no strange static. It was like the night before hadn't happened at all. I sat at my desk and pulled up the security logs. We keep digital records of sensor activity and camera footage. The logs for the service door showed 2 activations of the doorbell around 11 p.m., with no corresponding entry on the cameras. The camera feed was clear, just like I remembered. The system marked it as "no motion detected." That's weird because usually you need someone to press the button. Next, I checked the footage from the hallway for the time I opened the door. It showed me stepping out, looking around, and coming back in. Everything looked normal. I didn't see any shapes or movement that I might have missed in person. Then I looked at the audio logs from the computer station. Sometimes the system records mic input if you have certain debugging tools enabled, but everything was blank. I didn't see any record of the static or that distant voice I thought I heard. No interference or anomalies. It was like the sound never existed in the first place. Finally, I looked at the corridor cameras near the elevator. The footage around midnight, when Paulo said he saw lights flickering, showed a few seconds of scrambled static. Then complete darkness. The file corrupted itself for about 30 seconds. That matched the time I cut the power, but we both knew that standard emergency lights should have come on, or at least something. According to the timestamps, the feed went dead, then came back with no sign of flickering. It was just off, then on. Paulo still insisted he saw weird flashing. The footage didn't back him up, but it also didn't contradict him fully. The feed was just lost. I called Paulo later that day. He told me he felt off, like a mild headache and nausea. He said he only felt that way since the weird events the night before. He wanted me to confirm if we had some kind of gas leak or anything. I said I didn't smell anything, and the maintenance team found nothing on their checks. I had a mild headache too, though. I told him we should keep an eye on everything, but we both knew we couldn't do much more than that. The rest of that week, I stayed late one more time, but nothing happened. No weird doorbell rings, no flickering lights, no static. The building seemed back to its usual broken-down routine. I kept thinking about that night, though. Why did the doorbell ring with nobody there? Why did I hear that strange static? Was it some glitch with the building's wiring, or was it something I couldn't explain logically? Paulo and I never found a solid answer. We had no clues and no proof of anything out of the ordinary, other than the corrupted camera footage and the doorbell logs. I still work there. I still handle after-hours support. But every time I stay late, I feel a subtle tension in the back of my neck. If I have to go down that maintenance hallway, I walk faster. I make sure to keep the doors locked. If I hear a random noise, my chest tightens, and I check the cameras right away. So far, nothing else has happened. But I can't shake the feeling that something in that old building doesn't like to follow normal rules. That night stands out for me. It wasn't dramatic or violent, but it was unsettling. No matter how many times I tell myself it was just an electrical fault, I remember that voice in the static and the flickering lights. I can't forget the weight in my chest when I realized I was alone on that floor with something that didn't make sense. Even Paulo, who's used to quiet graveyard shifts, got rattled by what he saw. We never figured it out, and maybe we never will. I guess life goes on, and the building stands there, creaking and humming, always ready to remind us that sometimes you don't get neat answers. All I know is that I'm more cautious now, and whenever I hear that doorbell, I pause for a second and wait to see if there's really someone there. I still remember the dull hum of the fluorescent lights above my head when everything changed. I had worked plenty of night shifts in that small grocery store without any problems, but that night felt different from the start. The store closed at 8, and by 9 I was the only person there. I clocked in, grabbed my inventory clipboard, and checked the list of items that needed restocking. It seemed like any other shift. I had no reason to worry. Yet, I felt a strange tightness in my shoulders as if I was waiting for something to happen. My job was straightforward: refill the shelves, rearrange any misplaced items, and organize the back room so it would be easier to unload the morning delivery. The place was small, so it never took too long. The only parts that sometimes gave me trouble were the aisles with heavy cans or big bottles. The lighting in there wasn't great, so I had to be careful not to knock anything off the shelves when I moved the hand truck around. That night, I decided to start with the canned goods aisle because it was right next to the back room. I figured I'd knock out the tedious stuff first before moving on to lighter tasks. I flipped on the lights in the rear stock area and saw stacks of boxes lined against the walls. Some were open, some were taped shut with old, brittle tape. I also saw the dusty corners where no one had cleaned in a while. The store manager never seemed to care much about those details. The smell back there was a mix of cardboard, cleaning solution, and old produce that probably lingered under the pallets. I made a mental note to do a bit of sweeping if I had time. I walked over to the metal shelves along the back wall to check the expiration dates on canned peaches, tomatoes, beans, anything that had been sitting there for more than a few months. This was usually a quiet, almost mindless process. But about 15 minutes in, I heard something. It sounded like two voices coming from the main part of the store. They were speaking in low tones, not loud enough for me to catch any words. At first, I thought it might be the manager stopping by or a coworker who'd forgotten their keys. But nobody had a shift that late. I was supposed to be alone. I set down the can in my hand and listened. My pulse picked up a bit, and I wiped my palms on my jeans. I stood there for several seconds listening. Nothing. The place went back to the usual hum of the light fixtures and the faint drone of the refrigerator units. I took a deep breath and told myself it might have been the pipes or maybe the AC turning on. I went back to checking the cans, tilting them forward so I could read the printed dates. Most were fine, but I found a few that were pretty close to expiring. I put them aside on a separate cart. The normalcy of that task calmed me down a bit. I figured it was just my imagination running wild. I kept working until I finished that shelf. After that, I grabbed my clipboard and walked out to the aisle to move on to the next section. The store was silent and dim except for the overhead lights that I'd left on in a few spots. The produce area was dark. We always turned those lights off at closing. The dairy section near the back still had a few lights on because of the refrigerators. It looked the same as always. A row of milk, cheese, yogurt, and some eggs in clear plastic cases. Nothing seemed out of place. I stood there for a second, scanning the area, but I saw no one. I decided to keep working. I headed to the cleaning supplies aisle to restock a few shelves. That area always felt a bit cramped because of how the shelves were lined up. The boxes of detergent were heavy, and the smell of bleach was strong. I stacked some bottles at the front of the shelf, pushed the older ones forward, then placed the new ones behind. Halfway through that process, I thought I heard a sound again. This time it was more distinct. It was like whispers or a low conversation, but I couldn't make out words. My skin prickled, and I felt a twinge in my stomach. I stopped what I was doing and listened. The sound seemed to come from near the dairy aisle again. I set down the bottle I was holding and walked toward the coolers. My footsteps felt too loud. I tried to step lightly, but the floor was old linoleum, and it squeaked in places. The coolers let out a low hum. I paused at the corner and peered down the aisle. The overhead light was still on, shining off the white fridge doors. Nobody was there. I glanced around, checking behind the promotional stand with the stacked soda bottles. It was empty. I took another few steps and stood in front of the dairy case. Everything looked undisturbed. I whispered, "Hello? Anyone need help?" It sounded too loud in the stillness. No response. A chill ran down my arms and I rubbed them to get rid of the sensation. I told myself it could be the sound of a cooler fan or something mechanical, but it had been so clear, almost like people murmuring. I decided to do a quick walk around the perimeter of the store. The entrance doors were locked and the side doors were secured. The back door, near the stock area, was also locked. The alarm system was armed, so if someone had come in or gone out, it would have triggered. Everything checked out. I returned to the cleaning aisle and forced myself to finish the restocking. I worked faster than usual, eager to move on to a different section. I wanted to keep my mind off those voices. After finishing there, I went to the front of the store to scan the shelves near the registers. That area was small, just a couple of racks with candy and gum. I made sure everything was lined up. I wrote down an item or two that needed a reorder. The store felt too quiet now and my ears were on high alert for any noise. When the building settled, I twitched at the soft creaks. I started feeling jumpy, like any small sound would make me spin around. At one point, I thought I saw movement in my peripheral vision, but it was just the reflection of my own head in a window. My heart pounded. I told myself to calm down. It was probably just my nerves. I looked up at the clock above the door. It was around midnight. That was my normal time to sweep through the aisles and pick up any trash or loose items. I grabbed a broom from the back room. Before starting, I decided to step outside for a second and breathe some fresh air. I turned off the alarm, unlocked the door, and stood in the empty parking lot. The air was cool and the streetlights lit up the asphalt. There were no cars in sight except my own. Across the street, the local diner was closed. The windows were dark. I stayed there for about a minute, just trying to steady my breathing. Then I went back in, locked up, and turned the alarm on again. I started sweeping the aisles one by one, keeping my eyes peeled for anything out of place. I worked from the front to the back. By the time I reached the cooler section, I noticed something on the ground near the yogurt display. A few containers were scattered on the floor. They looked like someone had rummaged through them. One was overturned and the foil lid was peeled back like it had been half opened. My chest tightened as I wondered who could have done this. I bent down and picked up the containers. They were still cold. I checked the expiration date on one of them and placed it back on the shelf. I looked around for any footprints or signs of someone messing around, but I saw nothing else. I started to feel a drip of sweat on my forehead. The store was always on the colder side at night, so sweating wasn't normal for me. I felt my heart thudding in my chest. I set the broom aside and walked slowly through each aisle, peering around the corners and behind any displays. Everything else looked normal. The canned goods aisle was just as I had left it. The snacks aisle was neat and untouched. No weird noises, no sign of movement. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was there. I decided to check the security monitors in the manager's small office. The office was cramped and smelled like stale coffee. A single chair faced a desk with an old computer and a tiny monitor. The cameras showed 4 angles: the front entrance, one angle covering the registers, another angle on aisle 3, and one on the back door. We didn't have a full coverage system, so most of the store wasn't visible. I toggled through the footage for the past hour, but I didn't see anything suspicious on those 4 cameras. Nobody entered the front door, the back door, or the registers. Aisle 3 was empty the whole time. The feed had no audio, so I couldn't check if those voices were captured. Everything looked normal on the screen. I sighed and realized I was clenching my jaw. My neck felt stiff. I tried rolling my shoulders to loosen up, but I still felt on edge. I stepped out of the office, flicked off the light, and decided to finish up my tasks as quickly as I could. I only had to face a couple more hours until the morning. Usually I stayed until about 4 or 5, sometimes 6 if I had extra work. On that night, I hoped I could leave by 4. The tension was making me jumpy and I wanted to get out of there. I returned to the back room to organize some boxes that had arrived earlier. I sliced open the cardboard, sorted the contents, and placed them on the metal shelves. Now and then I paused and listened. At one point the building made a popping noise, probably from the cooling system. It made me jerk upright. My breathing grew shallow for a moment, but I forced myself to keep going. I took out my box cutter and opened more boxes. I kept an eye on the doorway to the store. Nothing moved. It was just me and the boxes. At around 2 in the morning, I went back out to do one last pass through the aisles. I noticed the floor glistened a bit under the lights. I realized it was probably from my sweaty palms when I had carried items around. I made a mental note to mop it if I had time. I also thought about the scattered yogurt containers from before. That memory made my chest tighten. It confirmed I wasn't imagining everything. Something physical had happened in that aisle. Somebody or something had been going through those items. I stepped into the dairy aisle again, glancing at the rows of milk jugs and cheese packages. Everything seemed back in place except for that faint sticky spot on the floor where one of the yogurt containers had leaked. I knelt down and touched it. It was tacky to the touch, but starting to dry. I grabbed a paper towel from the nearby cleaning station and wiped it up. As I stood, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up again. There was that sense of being watched. But when I turned around, the aisle was empty. I decided I'd had enough. I grabbed my things from the back room and quickly finished whatever was left on my checklist. I didn't want to wander around the aisles anymore. Every time I left the safety of the back room, I felt my heart beat faster, and I noticed my hands were still shaking a bit. The rest of the night, I mostly stayed near the stock area. I listened for more voices, but it stayed quiet. The store's usual humming and buzzing became the soundtrack to my final hours there. At around 4:30, I shut off the lights in the aisles one by one. I left on the ones needed for the early morning manager to see when he arrived. I locked the office, made sure all the coolers were closed, and turned off the small radio that sometimes played old music. I grabbed my backpack, set the alarm, and headed toward the front door. My heart was still racing. The door's lock clicked behind me, and I stepped into the dark parking lot. As I walked to my car, I looked back at the store windows. They were tinted and reflected the streetlights, so I couldn't see inside. I stood there for a moment, half expecting to see a silhouette. But there was nothing. I took a deep breath and got into my car. My hands were a bit clammy on the steering wheel. I told myself it might have been a trick of my mind, but those voices were too real. And the scattered items in the dairy aisle were a solid reminder that something actually happened. I still work there. I keep the same schedule. But ever since that night, I've been more alert. I double-check every aisle before I start my shift. I listen for any sign that I'm not alone. I haven't heard those voices again, but I can't forget them. Part of me wonders if someone found a way to get in and out without triggering the alarm. Part of me worries that I might hear them again someday, and this time find whoever is behind it. I don't know if that would be better or worse. All I know is that I keep my senses sharp now. Every small noise puts me on edge, and I'm constantly aware of the hum of the store around me. I don't think I'll ever stock the dairy aisle without remembering those whispers in the darkness. And to this day, I still have no explanation for what happened that night. I felt my stomach knot the first time I saw the sub-basement camera shake. It was a quiet Tuesday night and nothing had happened for hours. The front door was locked, the lobby was empty, and I was half asleep in my chair. Then I heard this rattling sound coming through the security monitor. It cut through the silence and snapped me awake. The camera feed on the small screen in front of me showed a blurry image of a parking spot and a storage cabinet. The camera wobbled for just a second like someone had bumped into it. I kept staring, waiting to see a person or a shape, but the frame settled, and there was nothing. My pulse started pounding right away. After all these years on the night shift, I thought I was used to random noises and flickering images, but that moment felt different. I got up, grabbed my flashlight, and walked down the hall toward the elevator. My heart was beating hard. I tried to breathe in slowly, in through my nose, out through my mouth. I pressed the elevator button for the sub-basement. The ride felt longer than usual. The doors opened, and I stepped into the dimly lit parking level. It smelled like concrete dust and old car tires. I pointed my flashlight around, checking each corner. Nothing moved. The silence down there was heavy. My footsteps sounded loud, and I tried to keep them quiet. I walked toward the camera on the wall. It was still angled correctly, not tilted or damaged. But on the floor below it, I noticed some scuff marks. They were fresh, or at least they looked clean enough to be new. I crouched down, ran my fingers over them, and felt a slight groove in the concrete. It was like someone had dragged something there or kicked the wall. I stood up and aimed my flashlight around. I wanted to find any sign of someone hiding. There were parked cars, mostly dark sedans and a few SUVs. I peeked around them, trying not to spook myself with my own shadow. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up, but I didn't see anyone. Then I noticed one of the storage cabinets had its door halfway open. The small metal latch was undone. I walked over, pulled the door open wider, and shined my flashlight inside. It was empty except for a couple of old boxes and a broken umbrella. It didn't look like anyone had taken anything. I just closed the door carefully and made sure it latched properly. I looked around one more time before heading back to the elevator. Once I was upstairs, I wrote an incident note in the log and tried to shake off the nerves. I told myself it was probably a resident or a curious neighbor who had been rummaging around. Maybe they bumped the camera or something else that made it sway. Still, I couldn't get rid of the uneasy feeling. My hands were still trembling when I poured a cup of coffee. The next day, I reported it to the superintendent, who also acts as the building's manager. He shrugged it off and said it was likely just someone looking for something in storage late at night. He suggested I keep an eye on it, but didn't seem too worried. I got the feeling he thought I was overreacting. I tried to stay calm about it, but I kept replaying that moment when the camera shook. I know what I saw, and I trust my instincts. Something was off. A week later, it happened again, but louder. This time, I was in the middle of my typical patrol. Around 2 in the morning, I always walk each hallway, check the doors, and make sure everything is locked. I had just gotten back to the lobby when I heard a metallic screech echo through the security monitor's speaker. It sounded like a scraping piece of metal and the rattle of something heavy, like chains. I froze. The sound repeated once more, then stopped. I darted behind the desk to see the sub-basement camera feed. Nothing moved, but I could see a slight flicker in the top corner of the screen. I grabbed my flashlight and sprinted to the stairwell. I ran down, skipping steps as I went. My breathing was fast, and I felt a rush of adrenaline in my arms and legs. The door to the sub-basement hallway felt colder than usual when I pushed it open. I stepped into the parking area, pointing my flashlight around. The lights were on, but they cast these long, weird shadows under the cars. I moved slowly, listening for any rattling chains or metal scraping. My shoes squeaked on the concrete floor. I walked toward the area near the large metal doors that lead to the building's gas cylinders. I could smell something faint, something sweet. It was a smell that reminded me of cologne. I stood still and sniffed the air. I don't wear any kind of fragrance, especially not on the job. This was out of place. I took a few steps closer to the gas storage area, watching for movement. Then I saw a shadow slide behind a parked SUV. It was just a glimpse of black, but it was enough to make my heart pound harder. I called out, "Hey, who's there?" My voice echoed. No answer. I went around the SUV, shining the light under it, around its sides, everywhere I could. I saw no one. The air felt thick. My hands were shaking, and sweat trickled down my forehead. I crouched down, looking at the dark space under another car. Still nothing. After a minute, I stood up, my knees feeling tight. I walked around the row of parked cars, checking each space. Empty. The entire sub-basement felt deserted, yet I was sure I'd seen a shadow move. I found no sign of forced entry on the gas room doors. They were closed and padlocked. The chain was secure. I couldn't figure out what caused the metallic screech. I sniffed the air again, but the cologne scent was already fading. I could barely detect it. My heart was still racing. I stood there for a few more minutes, scanning the area. I looked up at the security camera, the same one as before, but it was steady. No odd movement. I went back upstairs and filed another report. This time my supervisor seemed a bit more concerned, but he still said there was nothing much to do unless we actually caught someone. He asked me if I'd seen any actual intruder. I said no. I only saw a shadow and smelled cologne. He nodded and told me to stay on alert. Ever since then, my nights haven't been the same. I sit at the desk, staring at the sub-basement camera more than usual. Sometimes I think I see a flicker in the corner of the frame. I get up, check it out, and find nothing. Other times I hear a faint scraping sound coming from the speakers, but it's gone by the time I switch to the basement feed. I've tried playing back the recordings, but it all looks normal when I watch it again. A few times I caught myself jumping at every small noise. A delivery truck passing outside can make me twitch. On a Sunday night, around 3 in the morning, I decided to make a surprise check. I was feeling restless, and I wanted to see if I could catch whoever was down there messing around. I muted the TV in the lobby, locked the front door, and took the stairs slowly, one step at a time, to avoid making noise. My body was tense. My arms felt stiff and my breathing was shallow. I stopped a couple of times to listen for footsteps, but I only heard the hum of the ventilation system. When I entered the sub-basement, I didn't switch on my flashlight right away. The overhead lights provided some visibility, but they left dark patches around the corners. I stood still, looking around, trying to spot any movement. My eyes slowly adjusted, and after a few seconds, I walked down the first row of parking spaces. Most cars were covered in a thin layer of dust. I slid my hand across one of the hoods. It felt cool and gritty. My heart thumped in my chest. I kept checking behind the cars. Nothing. Then I heard a quiet clang, like a pipe hitting concrete. It came from the far end of the garage near the storage cabinets. My hands went clammy. I gripped the flashlight and made my way over. With each step, I felt my pulse in my ears. The smell of cologne hit me again, stronger this time. I flipped on my flashlight and aimed it at the metal doors of the storage cabinets. One of them was slightly open. I approached slowly and called out again, "Hey, show yourself." My voice cracked a bit, but I tried to sound firm. I swung the flashlight's beam inside the cabinet. There was some rolled-up carpet, a few dusty boxes, and some cleaning supplies. Nothing else. I stepped back and scanned the row of cabinets. They all looked locked except for that one. I bent down to check the lock. It didn't seem broken. It was just open, like someone had unlocked it with a key. I wondered if maybe a resident had a key and was storing something. But who does that at 3 in the morning without letting the doorman know? Suddenly, I heard a small shuffle behind me. I spun around, the flashlight shaking in my hand. I didn't see anyone. My chest felt tight. I shouted, "I know you're here. Stop hiding." Silence. My throat felt dry and I was breathing too fast. I forced myself to take a few slow breaths. I checked behind a couple of pillars, looked under a parked van, and even shined my light into the stairwell. Nobody was there, but the air still smelled like cologne. I stood there for a while, waiting to see if the person would show themselves or make another noise. Nothing happened. After a few minutes, I backed away toward the elevator. I tried to keep my head on a swivel, checking each angle as I walked. Finally, I pressed the button, got in, and returned to the lobby. I felt my skin tingling. I sat down at the desk, locked the elevator doors, and watched the monitors. I didn't hear anything else the rest of that night, but I was on edge until sunrise. The following morning, I told the superintendent that someone was definitely sneaking around in the sub-basement. I mentioned the open cabinet, the strong cologne smell, and the noises. He said he would remind residents to lock their storage cabinets and asked if I wanted to review all the camera footage with him. We spent a chunk of time looking at the recordings. We saw me walking around, shining my flashlight, but we didn't see anyone else in the video. There was no figure, no movement behind me, nothing that indicated a person was there. I started to question myself. Maybe I was imagining things, but the smell of that cologne was too distinct and the open cabinet with an unlocked latch was real. So was the shaking camera. So were the scraping noises. I couldn't explain those. The superintendent told me to keep doing my rounds as normal. He said if there was an intruder, we would catch them eventually. That didn't make me feel better. Now every time I start my shift, I feel that same tension in my chest. I check the sub-basement camera the moment I walk in. Some nights, everything is quiet. I almost start to believe that it was just a curious resident who changed their mind and left. But then, around 2 or 3 in the morning, I'll hear a metallic noise or catch a glimpse of a dark shape on the monitor. I'll grab my flashlight and rush downstairs only to find an open cabinet or a slight odor in the air. I never catch the person in the act. It's always like they're one step ahead of me. I keep telling myself that one day, I'll walk down there and shine my light right on them before they can slip away. Until that happens, I just stay alert. I keep a tight grip on my flashlight. I double-check every corner and every storage locker. I make sure the gas room is still locked. I scan the rows of cars and look under them. If I hear a scrape or a rattle, I hurry toward it. But as soon as I get close, the sound stops. It's been going on like this for weeks. No one has complained about missing items, and no one has confessed to sneaking around. I don't think it's someone doing maintenance. There's no schedule that matches these late-night visits. I haven't seen any forced entry points. I haven't noticed any real damage. But something is happening down there. I feel it in the air every time I walk in. My hands sweat and my body tenses up. I stand near the cars, waiting, hoping to see whoever it is. It's like a cat and mouse game, but I'm the only one who ever shows up in the light. I wonder how long it'll go on before someone else notices. Maybe the superintendent will take it more seriously if we find footprints, or if something valuable goes missing. For now, it's just me, the security cameras, and the smell of cologne in the dark. I do my job and I wait. I don't know how this will end, but I refuse to let whoever's down there keep me on edge forever. One night they'll make a mistake. They'll rattle the chain a little too long, or they'll bump the camera too hard, and I'll be there, flashlight in hand, ready to confront them. Until then, I stay alert every night, waiting for that same metallic scrape and that same shadow flitting across the cold concrete floor. I still remember the instant I saw the door to my room standing ajar. My heart pounded so hard that I heard the blood rushing in my ears. It was just a small gap, but it felt like a sign of something wrong. I stood in the corridor, stared at that open door, and told myself I might have just forgotten to lock it. but a voice in my head kept saying it was more than that. I had no idea what I would find inside. All I knew was I felt completely exposed. I was in another city for a week-long training program organized by my company. They put me up in an apart hotel that looked fine on the website, but in person, it was pretty worn down. The outside walls were faded, and the lobby smelled like stale air freshener. The elevator was ancient. It made loud clanking sounds, and sometimes it simply refused to work. On my first day, I got stuck inside for a minute when it jerked to a halt between floors. Eventually, it moved again, but that was enough to make me doubt its safety every time I stepped in. My daily routine was simple: training sessions at a nearby office building from morning to late afternoon, then a casual dinner somewhere close, and finally back to the apart hotel to rest. I didn't bring many belongings with me, just enough clothes for the week, a laptop, and a few personal items. The room itself was small, basically a bedroom combined with a kitchenette plus a cramped bathroom with weak water pressure. The walls were off-white. The carpet was thin and had a few suspicious stains near the entrance. The furniture was cheap and felt like it could fall apart if I leaned on it too hard. That particular night, I had gone out for dinner with a colleague. We found a simple restaurant a few blocks away and spent about an hour chatting about work. After we parted ways, I walked back alone. The weather was decent and the streets were quiet. I checked my phone a few times, saw a couple of notifications, nothing important. The lobby was nearly empty when I got inside, except for a man reading a newspaper behind the reception desk. He didn't look up when I passed by. I got into the elevator and pressed the button for my floor. It was slow. It stopped with a sudden jolt, the doors opened, and I headed down the hallway. The corridor lighting flickered a bit. There was an old beige wallpaper peeling at the corners. I noticed a bit of chipped paint near the top of my doorframe earlier that week, so I recognized my room right away. But this time the door stood partially open. My breath caught in my throat. I was pretty sure I had locked it before leaving. I don't consider myself overly cautious, but I never leave a door unlocked in a place like this. I froze for a moment. My thoughts were racing. I didn't hear any noise inside. No voices, no footsteps. Just a faint sound of the elevator cables in the distance and my own heartbeat. I told myself to be logical. Maybe I got distracted that afternoon and rushed out without checking the lock. It happens. But the more I tried to calm myself, the more I felt something was off. I pushed the door open slowly. The hinges squeaked. I stood on the threshold, scanning the area. The kitchenette looked the same as I left it. A small sink, a tiny fridge, and a counter with a microwave on top. The bed was unmade because I was in a rush that morning. My suitcase was still near the closet, zipped up. The TV was off, the remote on the nightstand. The bathroom door was half closed and the light was off. Nothing seemed disturbed at first. My phone flashlight revealed no odd shadows or shapes, but I kept my breathing shallow, anticipating someone jumping out from behind a curtain. I walked all the way inside and checked every corner. I opened the bathroom door carefully. The floor was dry. Everything looked normal. The shower curtain was pushed to one side. I checked the closet, looked under the bed, and found nothing. I was starting to relax a bit, thinking I just messed up the lock earlier. That's when I noticed the window above the kitchenette was slightly open. I remembered closing it that morning because the frame was loose and I didn't want wind rattling it. But there it was, propped open by an inch or two. Then I saw the water bottle. It was on the floor, rolling around near the base of the counter. I had left it by the sink. I was sure of that because I had taken a sip before leaving and placed it near the faucet. Now it was knocked over, the cap still on, but it was lying on its side. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I forgot I moved the bottle. Maybe I bumped it on my way out. But it all felt too strange. Door ajar, window open, bottle on the floor. My chest felt tight. I picked up the bottle and set it back on the counter. There was no sign of forced entry. The windows in that unit didn't have locks, just a flimsy latch I could slide into place. I double-checked my laptop and my wallet. They were both untouched. Nothing else seemed missing. The only evidence that something was off was that semi-open window and the bottle on the floor. I took a deep breath, locked the door from the inside, and went to find the building manager or the night guard. I needed to talk to someone about what might have happened. I grabbed my key, walked down the corridor, and took the stairs this time because I didn't trust the elevator enough that night. The stairwell smelled like bleach, and the walls were covered in a sickly yellow paint. My footsteps echoed. I felt a chill on my neck as if someone might be behind me, but I didn't see anyone. When I got to the lobby, the reception desk was empty. I glanced around, saw a small door behind the counter slightly open, and knocked on it. A man in a faded uniform stepped out, looking half asleep. He identified himself as the night porter. I asked him if he'd seen anyone go to my floor recently. He shook his head and said nobody had come through as far as he knew. I explained that I found my door open. He looked puzzled, said maybe the lock was faulty or maybe I just didn't close it right. But that didn't explain the window or the bottle. I asked if there were cameras. He shrugged and said the cameras were old and not all of them worked. I asked him to check anyway. He promised he'd look but didn't show much enthusiasm. I pressed him to see if anyone reported strange noises. He just repeated that he'd been at the desk all evening and hadn't noticed anything. I thanked him and left, feeling uneasy. I spent the rest of that night anxious. I locked the door and slid the chain in place. Then I took the flimsy wooden chair from the small table and wedged it under the doorknob. It looked ridiculous, but I didn't know what else to do. I laid in bed with the lights off, staring at the ceiling. Every small creak made me tense up. There were moments when I thought I heard footsteps outside, but it might have been just the plumbing or the old walls settling. My mind went over possible explanations, but none of them made me feel better. Eventually, I drifted off, though it was a restless sleep. The next day, my training went on as usual. I tried to focus on the presentations and group work, but I kept thinking about the apart hotel. At lunch, I told a coworker what happened. He joked that maybe there was a ghost or something. I forced a laugh, but I still felt unsettled. When the day ended, I debated whether to stay somewhere else, but the company had already paid for the week. I didn't have a big budget for a hotel room on my own. Also, packing up my stuff and moving felt like a hassle, so I decided I'd just be extra careful. I got dinner alone that night and headed back around 8. The hallway was silent when I got off the elevator. The lights flickered again. I checked my door. It was locked exactly as I had left it that morning. That was a relief. I walked in, turned on the lights, and scanned the place like I was doing a security check. Nothing was out of place. I tested the windows, still locked. The bottle was right where I'd left it. I exhaled and started to relax. The whole night, though, I never felt comfortable. I triple-checked the door whenever I stepped out, even if it was just to get ice from the machine down the corridor. When I was in the room, I kept the TV on to mask any small noises. I barricaded the door again with the chair. I didn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone standing in the corner of the room staring at me. I'd jolt awake, sweat on my forehead, heart hammering. Then I'd realize I was alone. On the third night, the elevator died again. I came back from a late dinner, pressed the button and waited for a while, but the doors never opened. I didn't see anyone around to fix it, so I climbed 4 flights of stairs with a bag of takeout in my hand. My legs were burning by the time I reached my floor. I noticed the hallway lights were a bit dimmer. One of the bulbs was out near my door. I felt on edge, as if the darkness might hide someone. I listened for noises, just silence and my heavy breathing. Inside the room, nothing had changed, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I checked the closet again, opened every cabinet, even looked behind the shower curtain. Empty. Still, I felt a tension in my chest. There were a few times I thought I heard the floor creaking in the hallway, but maybe it was the wind or the building's old pipes. I tried to ignore it. I ate my takeout on the small table, with my chair turned to face the door so I could see if anyone tried to open it. Every bite felt forced. My nerves were shot. That night I barely slept. I lay there, listening to the hum of the mini fridge. My body was on high alert, like I was ready to jump up at any moment. I kept imagining hearing a faint click in the lock or soft footsteps just beyond the door. Around 2 a.m., I heard a creak in the hallway. It sounded close. I sat up, my heart thumping. My eyes were locked on the gap under the door where I could see a bit of light from the corridor. There was a shadow just for a second, like someone had walked by. I waited, holding my breath. Then it was gone. My ears were ringing in the silence. In the morning, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I went downstairs to the reception area and asked if there was another room available, maybe on a lower floor or a part of the building that felt more secure. The morning clerk apologized and said they were full. I asked about the security cameras again. She said the manager was out, and the night porter probably forgot to look at the footage. She promised to leave a note for him. I felt frustrated, but there wasn't much I could do. For the next 2 nights, the same pattern repeated. I went out for dinner, came back, locked myself in, and barely slept. The training sessions were difficult because I kept yawning and losing track of conversations. My eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep. People asked if I was okay. I told them I was having trouble with the accommodations. One guy joked that maybe the place was haunted. Nobody seemed to take it seriously, so I stopped bringing it up. On my last night there, I tried to relax. I forced myself to watch some late-night TV, random shows I wouldn't normally care about. I kept the volume low enough that I could still listen for any movement outside. I propped the chair under the knob again. My body felt worn out from the stress. At one point, around midnight, I realized I was dozing off with the TV remote in my hand. I snapped awake when I heard a soft thud in the hallway. I froze, turned off the TV, and listened. There was no follow-up sound. I stared at the door, my ears tuned to the slightest hint of a footstep. My throat was dry. I felt the hair on my arms stand up. I didn't hear anything else. Maybe it was just another guest passing by. Maybe it was someone shifting luggage, but my body wouldn't relax. My muscles were tense and my breathing was shallow. I sat there for a long time, afraid to move. Eventually, I stood up and tiptoed to the door. I looked through the peephole. The corridor was empty. The light flickered once, then steadied. I went back to bed and tried to sleep, but every time the building groaned or the pipes clicked, I sat up. It was a long night. Early the next morning, I packed my bag, shoved everything inside, and left the apart hotel without waiting for anyone. I just dropped the key at the front desk. The same man from the first night was there, looking tired. He gave me a small wave, and I nodded. I didn't bother asking him for any updates. I just wanted out of that place. Even once I was outside on the sidewalk, I kept checking over my shoulder. There was a deep sense of relief when I finally got a taxi to the train station. I completed the training program later that day. As soon as I was done, I caught the first possible flight home. The whole experience left me uneasy. I still don't know if someone actually got into my room or if I made a mistake with the lock that first night. I don't know why the window was open or how that bottle ended up on the floor. Maybe it was just a weird coincidence. But it felt like a warning that I wasn't as safe as I thought. Even now, whenever I stay in any unfamiliar hotel, I triple-check the lock and wedge a chair under the doorknob if I can. It's a habit I can't shake. I never want to feel that vulnerable again. I got stuck at work tonight, and I'm not talking about a simple 15-minute delay. I'm talking about staying in the print shop until almost midnight, alone, surrounded by machines that sometimes act up when there's nobody around to watch them. I didn't believe in any of that paranormal stuff before, but something happened that rattled me in a way I can't shake. I wasn't ready for it. I was tired, I was fed up, and I just wanted to finish my job and go home. But those machines had a different plan, and I'm still trying to make sense of it. I work in a small printing company. We print flyers, brochures, and sometimes bigger orders for local businesses. It's usually busy during the day with a few co-workers around. Today, things piled up. We had a rush order that needed to be finished by morning, and everyone else had already clocked out. I volunteered to stay because I figured I could handle it on my own. I've done it a dozen times. I was used to the noises, The hum of the machines, the clacking of the rollers, the smell of ink and paper in the air, all that was normal for me. Around 11 at night, I was finishing the last batch. The machines were going full speed. I had set up the press to print a large stack of posters. The place usually has a comfortable, constant drone. The press rolling, the smaller copiers chugging along, the occasional beep from the digital printers. But then everything stopped. It felt like the entire shop inhaled and held its breath. The sudden silence hit me hard. It was so quiet I could hear my own breathing. I stood there looking around, thinking it was a power outage. But the overhead fluorescent lights were still on. The old clock on the wall was still ticking. The ventilation fans were still humming. That meant it wasn't a total blackout. I glanced at the control panel on the big press, and the screen was blank. The smaller printers were also dark. There was no reason for all of them to shut off at once if it wasn't a breaker issue. I tried to keep my cool. I went over to the breaker box, which is in a small closet down the hall. Every switch looked fine. Nothing was tripped. I checked them one by one, flipping them off and on, just to see if there was a minor glitch. The lights never flickered. The fans never changed speed. It was all normal except for the machines I needed to finish my job. I walked back to the main room. As soon as I stepped inside, I noticed one printer was on again. It wasn't one of our main presses, it was a smaller laser printer we sometimes use for test prints. It was spitting out blank pages. Page after page slid into the output tray, but they weren't completely clean. They had little smudges of ink like half-printed text or graphics, but it was all incomplete. It reminded me of a machine running without any real file to print, almost like it was printing random streaks. I felt a rush of adrenaline. My pulse sped up, my breathing became shallow. I walked straight to it and looked at the display panel. It was lit up, but there was no job in the queue. Nothing on the screen told me what it was doing. It just kept spitting out those empty sheets. The printer's internal fans were on. The gears were turning. It wasn't normal. I tapped the cancel button. Nothing changed. I pressed it again, holding it for a moment. Still nothing. I reached for the power button. That didn't do anything either. I yanked the power cord from the outlet. The printer shut off immediately, and the motor stopped. I stared at it for a few seconds. My hands were shaking. I could feel sweat forming on my forehead. My stomach felt twisted like I'd just gotten horrible news. It wasn't the first time weird stuff happened in this shop. Sometimes a printer would beep in the middle of the night or start a calibration cycle on its own. But it was never this intense, and never with everything else shutting down at once. I didn't want to panic. I told myself there had to be a technical reason, maybe a surge or a glitch in our network. But the lights were fine, the fans were fine, and we have separate circuits for the machines. I tried to calm down. My mind was racing, but I decided to check the rest of the shop, make sure nobody was inside messing with me. I locked the front door earlier. I was positive I had, because that's standard procedure when I stay late. I also checked the back door after the last coworker left. It was locked. I walked around with quick steps, flipping on every light I could find. The break room was empty. The supply closet was empty. The bathrooms were empty. I even opened the manager's office. Nobody there. Everything looked the same as it had an hour ago. I didn't see any footprints or anything that stood out. The doors and windows were locked. The only sound was the hum of the building's ventilation. I went back to the main print area, planning to power up the big press again. I needed to finish the job, no matter how weird I felt. Deadlines aren't flexible, and if we don't deliver on time, we lose clients. As I walked up to the console, I noticed that the press was no longer completely off. The display was flickering, like it was trying to boot up. That set me on edge. I hadn't touched it since it shut down. I leaned close to the screen. I smelled a faint burnt odor like overheated plastic or rubber. The display flickered once more and went blank. I reached out to power it on using the normal switch, and it came to life with a loud whir. All the internal parts started spinning, and the screen showed the usual startup sequence. I felt a small wave of relief, because at least it was turning on now. But then, without me selecting anything, it started running paper through. The press is large and it can handle reams of paper at high speed. It started feeding pages that were already in the loading tray, as if there was a queued job. The rollers squeaked and the sound of the pages rustling filled the room. The output tray caught them, but they were blank or partially covered in random ink patterns. I reached for the control panel to cancel any jobs, but the touchscreen wouldn't respond. I kept pressing cancel all jobs, but it did nothing. My heart thudded. My hands were cold and clammy. I stepped back, watching the machine churn out these half-printed sheets. Each sheet was a mess of smears and random streaks. I thought about unplugging it, but I hesitated. It's a massive machine with multiple cords and connectors. Instead, I tried flipping the breaker dedicated to this press. So I hurried back to the breaker box, found the specific switch for the main press and flipped it off. Then I flipped it on again. I returned to the press, hoping it would be reset. The press was off this time. No lights on the panel, no movement. Good. I exhaled, trying to steady myself. I placed a hand on top of the machine. It felt warm. I could smell ink and paper dust, nothing unusual except for the slight burnt odor from before. For a few seconds I just stood there, scanning the room. The fluorescent lights made everything look pale and flat. The shadows on the walls looked sharper than usual. I couldn't see anything else out of place. I considered the possibility of an electrical fault. Maybe something was short-circuiting, causing random signals to go through the machines. I thought about calling an electrician or my boss, but it was already late. My boss usually has his phone off after 10. Still, I pulled out my phone and dialed his number. No answer. I sent him a quick text message. Machine's acting up. Possibly electrical problem. Might not finish tonight. I hoped he'd see it first thing in the morning. I had to make sure nobody had broken in to sabotage us. I didn't find any signs of forced entry, but my mind kept racing with scenarios. Maybe someone tampered with the machine software or messed with the wiring. I opened a few control panels on the smaller printers. Everything looked normal. No wires pulled, no odd devices attached. The PC that we used to send print jobs was still on, but it showed no active print queue. I wiggled the mouse, stared at the screen. Nothing unusual. No open programs except the default printing interface. I opened the event logs to see if anything printed. Nothing in the log about those blank pages. That made me feel sick. Normally, every job that goes to a printer gets logged. Even if it's a blank page, it shows something in the system. This time, there was no record. I heard my own heartbeat in my ears. I shut down the PC, hoping that maybe everything would just stay off if the computer was off. Then I walked to the smaller printer I'd unplugged. I plugged it back in for a second just to see if it would stay off. It did. No lights, no noise. Good. I tried to get back to work. I still had some finishing tasks to do with the posters we had already printed. I turned on the finishing machine, a folder and cutter. It started up fine, so I fed in some posters to fold. It worked for a minute, then shut off. No error messages, no jam. It just powered down. I cursed under my breath. I flicked the switch off and on again. Nothing happened. I felt a jolt of anger. I hit the side of the machine with the palm of my hand, but that didn't help. I stared at it, feeling a mix of frustration and nervous energy. Suddenly, I heard a click from behind me. I spun around. One of the copiers lit up. Its green status light glowed, and the menu screen flashed. Then it made the usual whirring noises like it does when it's warming up. I swallowed hard. I felt my mouth go dry. I walked over, my legs feeling stiff. On the screen, it showed ready. I hadn't pressed anything. I went into the menu. It showed no stored jobs. I tapped the home button, then stepped back, waiting to see if it would print on its own. For a few seconds, it stood there quietly. I felt cold air brushing against my neck from the vents above. My heart was racing so fast I could feel a dull pressure in my chest. The copier did nothing else. It seemed normal now, like it was waiting for an input. I pressed the power button to shut it down. It responded right away, going through its shutdown cycle. I waited. The lights turned off and the fan stopped. I wondered if maybe the machines were somehow doing an internal check or auto-clean cycle, but it didn't feel right. It felt more like they were acting on their own schedule. I checked the time on my phone. It was almost midnight. I still had a pile of posters that needed trimming, but the finishing machine wouldn't even turn on. The big press was shut down at the breaker, and I didn't want to risk turning it back on again. The smaller printers had freaked me out, and I'd already unplugged one. I decided to do one last sweep of the building, lock everything up, and leave. I knew I'd catch heat for not completing the job, but I couldn't focus in there anymore. Walking through the shop felt tense. My senses were on high alert. Every little noise made me jump, like the creak of the floor or the hum of the ventilation. My breath was shallow, and my palms were sweaty. I reached the front door and tested it. Locked. I double-checked the back door. Also locked. I paused at the back hallway, looking at the rows of storage shelves and the dimly lit corners. I felt like I was being watched, but I saw nothing. I returned to the main area, gathered my bag, and took one last glance around. The machine stood there, silent. The overhead lights buzzed softly. I felt the tension in my back and neck. My throat was tight. I walked out, turned off the main lights, and locked the door behind me. The moment I stepped outside, I felt relief. The cool night air hit me, and I let out a long exhale. The drive home was uneasy. I kept replaying everything in my head. I tried to think of logical explanations. Maybe an electrical surge messed with the machines. Maybe the computers had a glitch. Maybe our network had some weird bug. But none of that fully explained the printers turning on by themselves or printing pages that didn't show up in the system logs. I thought about calling someone else who works there, but it was too late for that. When I finally got home, I dropped my keys on the kitchen counter and went straight for a glass of water. My hands were still shaking a bit. My chest felt tight. I tried to calm myself, breathing slowly. I thought about what I'd say to my boss in the morning. I knew he wouldn't believe me right away, so I'd probably focus on the electrical explanation. I would mention the random printing, but call it a possible software glitch. I didn't plan on mentioning the tense feeling I had or how the machines seemed to have a mind of their own. I wasn't sure how to describe it without sounding ridiculous. That was a couple hours ago. I'm writing this down now because I need to process it. I feel uneasy, even thinking about going back to the shop tomorrow. I keep imagining the machines powering on by themselves again. I can picture the blank pages spewing out. I can hear that heavy silence when they all shut off together. My heart rate picks up just remembering it. I still can't make sense of it. I know I locked up everything. I know there was no one else inside. I'm sure it wasn't a complete power failure because the lights and fans stayed on. There was no obvious sign of tampering or forced entry. Yet the machines acted on their own, and it wasn't the first time weird stuff happened there. We've all heard the stories of printers calibrating at odd hours, small glitches in the middle of the night, but never this many all at once. Tonight was different. It felt directed. It felt like something was in control, flipping them on and off. I plan to talk to my boss about bringing an electrician or a technician to inspect everything top to bottom. I'm not looking forward to it. I'm not sure how I'll concentrate on my work. But a job is a job, and I don't have many options. That doesn't change the fact that what happened tonight shook me. I've never felt such a jolt of fear in a place I've spent so many late nights. Usually, I felt safe there, even alone. Now, I'm not so sure. For now, I'm just hoping that tomorrow is normal. I want to see those presses working the way they're supposed to, with no surprises. I want to finish the jobs and get them out to the clients. I want the hum of the machines to feel routine again, but I can't ignore what happened. I keep replaying that moment when they all powered down in unison. That heavy silence still echoes in my head, and the sight of that lone printer spitting out blank sheets like it was possessed still makes my skin crawl. I guess I'll find out tomorrow if this was a one-time glitch or something else. Until then, I'm on edge, waiting for whatever might come next. I'm going to be honest right from the start. I've never been the kind of guy who scares easily. But that night, everything felt off. I noticed some random guy standing under a streetlight, and I felt a chill run through my body. I had a weird knot in my gut, and my instincts told me something wasn't right. I want to tell you how this all happened and why it still makes me uneasy. I don't have any fancy explanations or deep moral lessons. It's just what happened, exactly the way I saw and felt it. I started running at night about a year ago. My days got busy, and by the time I finished work and handled my usual errands, the sun was already down. I found that I liked running after midnight because the streets were mostly empty, and the park near my apartment was quiet. I could focus on my breathing, the motion of my legs, and the steady rhythm of my steps on the pavement. It was my way of relaxing. On the night this happened, I left my apartment around 11:30 p.m. I had a long, rough day at work. I wanted to burn off the stress, so I put on my running shoes, tied them tight, grabbed a light jacket, and stepped outside. The air was cold, the kind of cold that makes you take a sharp breath when you open the door. I put in my earbuds and walked the short distance to the park entrance, hands in my pockets to keep them warm until I started moving. When I reached the park, I noticed right away that it was quieter than usual. No cars were passing by, and there was barely any wind. The lampposts inside the park gave off that dull yellow light that always makes everything look kind of flat and lifeless. I glanced around before I began running. The sidewalks were empty. A couple of benches sat under some trees, but no one was there. It felt still. I popped one earbud out because I like to hear what's around me, especially in an empty area at night. Then I started jogging. At first, I felt my usual burst of energy. My legs loosened up and my mind cleared. I concentrated on my breathing, matching it to my pace. Breathe in for 2 steps, out for 2 steps, and keep the pace steady. I did one loop around the main part of the park, a loop that's about a quarter mile. Then I headed down a narrower path, one that goes around a small pond before curving back toward the main area. After about 10 minutes, I circled back to the open area near a row of lampposts. Usually, I barely notice those lampposts, but this time, something caught my eye. I saw a figure standing under one of them. He looked tall, and he was facing my direction. I couldn't see his face clearly, but the way he stood told me he was watching me. I had this sudden spark of anxiety. My heart rate sped up, and I told myself I was overreacting. People sometimes linger in the park at night to smoke or just stare at the sky. I glanced at him, nodded, and continued my loop. I kept running, but my focus was gone. I was thinking about that guy. Every time I exhaled, I felt a slight quiver in my chest. I tried to shake it off. I told myself I was being paranoid. I did the usual loop again. The path around the pond is pretty dark, and my breath was the loudest thing in my ears. I pushed forward with longer strides, trying to regain a good rhythm. When I returned to that row of lampposts, I saw him again. Same spot, same posture. He was standing near the third lamp from the corner. He didn't move. I slowed down, trying to see if he was smoking or checking his phone, anything to explain why he was standing so still. But I didn't notice any glow from a phone screen or the slight motion of a cigarette. He was just there, facing the path. I felt uneasy. My chest tightened. My mouth went dry. I swallowed hard and decided not to engage. I kept my pace, though I was tempted to speed up. I didn't want him to see that I felt threatened. I focused on the sound of my steps, the faint echo of them in the empty park, and kept my gaze straight ahead until I passed him. He didn't say a word. I could hear him breathe for a moment, but that might have been my imagination. Still, it sounded too close, like he was less than a few feet away. I forced myself to complete another loop. It took me about 6 or 7 minutes. The corners felt darker, and the wind started to pick up, rustling leaves on the ground. The darkness around the pond got heavier in my mind, and I kept looking over my shoulder to make sure no one was behind me. Each time I looked, I saw no one. My pulse pounded in my ears, and I felt a light sweat break out on my forehead, even though the temperature was cold. By the time I made it back to the row of lampposts for the third time, I expected to see him there again, but I didn't. I glanced around, letting my eyes adjust. No one. I was torn between relief and a spike of adrenaline. My relief told me he was gone. Maybe he left. My anxiety told me he was just out of sight. I stopped for a second, pretending to stretch my calves. I scanned the area. Nothing. I looked toward the benches, the cluster of trees, and even beyond the park's fence into the street. Still no sign of him. I started jogging again, but at a slower pace. My senses were on high alert. Every small noise made me jolt. The wind pressed some branches together, making a faint scraping sound, and I stiffened. I tried to clear my thoughts. I told myself to calm down, finish the lap, and go home. I wanted to avoid freaking myself out more than necessary, but after about another minute I turned onto a path that led to the park's exit. That path had fewer lights, but it was a shorter route to the main street. I figured I'd just leave right away. As I reached the midpoint of that path, I saw movement behind me in my peripheral vision. I turned my head quickly. At first I thought it was just a shadow or maybe a branch swaying. Then I saw him, the same figure about 30 yards back, walking with a deliberate pace. He was definitely following me. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I could tell he was taller than me, maybe by a couple of inches. He had on a dark hoodie, black pants, and he kept his hands in his pockets. My stomach felt like it dropped. My heart hammered against my ribs. My breathing went shallow. I thought about sprinting, but I didn't want to let him see me panic yet. Instead, I kept a steady jog, then took a different path that veered left. That route would lead me around the pond again, but there was another exit that connected to the main street from the backside of the park. I hoped maybe he would stop following if he thought I was just minding my own business. I heard his footsteps. They were heavier than mine. Maybe he wasn't trying to be quiet, or maybe he didn't care if I heard him. I kept sneaking glances over my shoulder, trying not to be obvious, but I still saw him each time. He was keeping his distance, maybe 30 or 40 yards. He wasn't running. He was just walking with a consistent speed. I decided to move faster. I breathed in hard and picked up my pace, pushing my legs to move, ignoring the slight burn in my calves. My jacket felt tight on my shoulders as I swung my arms to run. My eyes started darting around, looking for the way out. I passed the pond, saw the reflection of a single lamppost in the water, and kept going. The footsteps behind me got quieter. Maybe I was outpacing him, or maybe he was hanging back. I could see the park's side exit up ahead. There was a chain-link fence and a gate that opened onto a sidewalk. Beyond that sidewalk was a busier street, with some late-night bars and restaurants. It wasn't super crowded at that hour, but there were usually a few people around. I felt a surge of urgency. I wanted to be near people. I pictured a row of cars, some neon lights from bars, anything that would make me feel less isolated. I reached the gate and pushed it open so fast it rattled. I almost tripped over a crack in the sidewalk as I stumbled out. I heard the gate clang behind me, and I turned around to see if he was still coming. I couldn't see him right away. The exit was dimly lit, so I looked for movement in the shadows. Nothing. I stood there breathing hard, my sweat cooling in the night air. I felt a light breeze on my face and tried to calm down. Then I spotted him a few yards inside the gate. He didn't step out. He stayed in the park near the fence, looking in my direction. I still couldn't see his face clearly, but I could see he was standing with one hand on the chain-link gate, holding it open. I didn't know if he had a weapon or what. I just knew that if he came out, I would either have to run or get ready to defend myself. I turned and jogged quickly down the sidewalk toward the main street. My legs felt rubbery, like they could give out at any moment. My chest was tight, and I kept swallowing to ease the dryness in my throat. The main street was a block away, so I forced myself to keep moving. I could see the glow of neon signs from a bar called Hank's, which stayed open late. That sign was my next goal. I didn't want to look back yet. I just wanted to get closer to people. I reached the corner, and Hank's was right there with an old-school sign flickering orange and blue. A couple of guys stood outside, smoking and talking. Their voices carried in the quiet street. I felt a wave of relief. I stepped in front of the bar and finally turned around to see if that guy had followed me out of the park. He wasn't there. I looked up and down the sidewalk, scanned the edge of the park, even squinted to see if he was hiding behind a tree or sign. Nothing. He was gone. My breathing was ragged, and my shirt clung to my back. I stood there for a moment, hands on my hips, trying to calm down. The two guys outside the bar glanced at me. One of them asked if I was okay. I nodded, said yeah, just a hard run, and forced a short laugh. But my mind was racing, thinking about where that man could have gone so fast. I didn't know if he left the park or if he was just standing in the shadows waiting. All I knew was I couldn't see him anymore. I considered asking the guys to walk me to my apartment, but it was only 2 blocks away, and I felt embarrassed. Maybe I was making this bigger in my head than it really was. I tried to think rationally. He could have been messing with me, or maybe he thought I looked suspicious. Sometimes people do strange things at night. I hung around outside that bar for a few minutes, letting my heart rate settle down. I kept scanning the area. Still no sign of him. Eventually, I started walking home. The tension in my body made my neck stiff, and my shoulders ached. Every time I heard footsteps or saw movement in my peripheral vision, I tensed up, but nobody else followed me. When I reached my apartment building, I went straight inside and locked the door behind me. My hands were shaking. My breath was still unsteady. I stood in the hallway for a moment, leaning against the wall, staring at the closed door. My mind was full of questions. Did I overreact? Was he just some random guy taking a walk? Or was he waiting for a chance to jump me? I ended up sitting on my couch, staring at the dark TV screen. I thought about calling someone, my brother, a friend, just to tell them what happened. But I felt a bit stupid. No crime had actually taken place. Nobody got hurt. The guy never confronted me directly. It was just his presence, his stare, and the way he seemed to follow me. That was enough to make me feel vulnerable. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured him standing in the park, under that lamppost, not moving, not speaking, just staring at me. The next day, I woke up later than usual. I felt drained. My body was sore, and my mind kept replaying the events over and over. I was tempted to go back to the park that evening, just to prove to myself that I could handle it. But a knot formed in my stomach every time I pictured stepping onto that path again. I ended up taking a break from running for a few days. When I finally went back, I chose a different route around my neighborhood, avoiding the park. Eventually, I convinced myself to return to the park, but I went earlier, while there was still more light and a few people around. I never saw that guy again. I still don't know why he stood under that lamppost or why he followed me. Maybe he wanted to rob me, or maybe he was bored and decided to mess with some random runner. It could have been anything. All I know is that it left me rattled. It made me realize how quickly that feeling of safety can vanish when you're alone, especially at night, in a place that's usually calm. That's the whole story. No big twists, no dramatic showdown. Just a guy in a hoodie who decided to stand there staring me down, then followed me through a dark park. If I had to guess, I'd say he was sizing me up. Or maybe he just got a kick out of seeing me sweat. Either way, I learned to trust my instincts a bit more. I still run at night sometimes, but I keep my eyes wide open now. If something feels off, I pay attention. And I remember that night whenever I feel like ignoring those gut signals that tell me something isn't quite right. I never liked being in that basement at 3 in the morning. The first time I walked down that narrow corridor, I felt my skin tense. The ceiling was low, the lights barely worked, and a dusty smell stuck to my clothes. Still, I had a job to do, catalog and digitize boxes of old bank documents. It was supposed to be routine, just me, the files, and a computer. But it didn't stay routine for long. I work for a large financial institution in the city. They assigned me to organize decades worth of old paperwork in a storage area beneath the main building. It's not the kind of job most people want. It's dark, lonely, and the air always feels stale. The corridor that leads to the archive has a few security cameras, but there's no security guard walking around at night. The building's management decided that cameras were enough. They told me not to worry. Most people avoided that basement because it was boring, not because it was dangerous. The first few nights went smoothly. I'd arrive around 11 in the evening, use my special ID badge at the elevator, and go down to the sublevel. The doors would open, and I'd step into a short hallway with flickering lights. On the right, there was a small restroom that had been out of order for years. On the left, there was a locked door with a keypad that led to some old maintenance tunnels. Straight ahead, maybe 15 steps from the elevator, was the door to the archive. It was a thick metal door that felt heavier than any normal door should. Inside, there were rows of shelves and stacks of boxes. Each box was stuffed with folders, files, receipts, and typed memos dating back to the 1970s. My job was to open each box, scan documents, label them in a system, and then place the files in a new container. The bank wanted to reduce its paper storage, so they needed everything digitized. It was tedious, but I tried to keep myself busy with music. I brought my phone and a portable speaker. Some nights, I listened to old rock songs. Other nights, I put on podcasts. I was alone down there, so no one complained. Then came that strange night. I remember checking my watch. It was around 1 in the morning. I was behind schedule, so I was scanning faster than usual. I got up to stretch my legs and walk around for a minute. That's when I heard a dragging sound overhead, like someone shuffling their feet across the floor above me. I paused my music and listened. The noise repeated. It sounded like slow footsteps. The bank has a janitorial crew that sometimes works overnight, so I assumed it was the cleaning staff. But the movement was strange, heavy, uneven, and deliberate. It stopped abruptly. I didn't think much of it at first. I went back to scanning, finished my shift around 4 in the morning, and headed up in the elevator. On my way out, I saw the night receptionist. I asked if there was a janitor or maintenance worker upstairs during the last few hours. She looked at me like I was confused. She said no one was on the schedule that night except me and a security guy in the control room. She mentioned that the floors were cleaned earlier in the evening, around 8 or 9, but after midnight there shouldn't have been anyone else. That felt wrong to me. I was sure I heard something, but I shrugged it off and went home. The next night, I tried to ignore any noises. I figured my mind was exaggerating. Still, I kept my eyes on the ceiling whenever I got that sensation of not being alone. Everything seemed quiet until around 2 in the morning. That's when I picked up another sound, more faint this time. It was a similar dragging of feet, but it was short, like a few steps. Then silence. I stepped into the corridor outside the archive and listened. Nothing. I walked slowly, looking at the old restroom door and the locked maintenance door. Both were shut. I thought maybe it was just the building settling or some loose pipes. I didn't see any movement. I went back to finish my work. When I wrapped up at about 3:30, I shut off the lights in the archive and stepped into the corridor again. My flashlight caught some dark streaks on the floor near the old restroom. They looked like marks from shoes with dirt on them. I kneeled down to look closer. The marks were about the length of a regular shoe, and there were 2 or 3 distinct smudges leading to the restroom door. I touched one of them with my fingertip. It felt like dried mud or something similar. It was fresh enough that it didn't look faded or dusty. At that point, I felt a tightness in my chest. I wondered if there was someone creeping around. But the door to the restroom was locked from the outside. There was a small sign that said, "Out of service." It had been there for years. I never saw anyone go in or out. I checked the lock. It was still secured. I couldn't open it even if I wanted to. I took a few pictures of the marks with my phone. Then I went upstairs, told the receptionist about it, and went home. She just shrugged. She said maybe someone from maintenance got the key and used the restroom for storage. It seemed odd that no one mentioned it, but I couldn't prove anything else. I tried to sleep that morning, but my mind kept imagining someone hiding in that old restroom. The following night, I got to the building a little earlier. I went down to the archive, but before I started working, I took a walk around the sublevel. I shined my flashlight on every inch of the corridor. The restroom door was still locked. The maintenance door was still locked. I didn't see any new footprints or mud. I went into the archive, turned on the overhead lights, and started my routine again. I had a stack of boxes to go through. Each box had papers from the 1980s, full of typed memos, canceled checks, and other financial records. I tried to focus on my task, but I caught myself glancing at the ceiling every few minutes. It made me anxious. At one point, I noticed I was gripping the scanner too hard. Around midnight, the building's lights flickered. It wasn't a full power outage, but it was enough to make the overhead fluorescents blink. My computer screen dimmed for a second. My heart raced. I didn't like the idea of being stuck down there in the dark. I had a flashlight, but that didn't calm me much. I waited for the power to settle, then got back to work. The faint buzzing sound of the fluorescent lights filled the silence. I turned on some music at a low volume. Around 1:30, I needed a break. I locked the archive door behind me, walked to the elevator, and pressed the button for the lobby. The elevator hummed as it rose. When the doors opened, the lobby was empty except for the night receptionist behind the desk. I grabbed a snack from a vending machine and drank some water. I lingered there for a while, not wanting to go back down. Eventually, I realized I was wasting time. I had to finish. When I got back to the basement, I noticed a slight shift in the air. It felt colder. The corridor was quieter than usual. I stepped up to the archive door and swiped my ID to unlock it. I heard the beep, pushed it open, and caught a glimpse of my reflection in a small security mirror near the ceiling. I looked tired. My eyes were bloodshot. I walked in, flipped on the lights, and froze. One of the boxes near my desk had been moved. I usually keep them in neat rows, all facing one direction. Now this box was angled, like someone had nudged it aside. The lid was partly off, exposing some files inside. I stared at the box for a moment. My pulse sped up. I didn't see anyone else in the room, but the rows of shelves went pretty far back. I walked toward the box. Nothing seemed missing, but the fact that it was moved at all made me feel uneasy. The desk drawer where I kept my personal stuff was still locked. I turned around and surveyed the aisles of shelves. The overhead lights were strong enough to illuminate most of the area, but the corners looked dim. I held my breath and listened. No sounds. I forced myself to check the rest of the rows. I walked through each aisle, pointing my flashlight between shelves. I didn't see any movement or signs of someone hiding. I came back to the desk and stood there deciding what to do next. I thought about calling security, but then I realized they might just blame me for not locking the door properly. They tended to dismiss any concerns. Plus, I didn't have any proof that someone was in there except for the shifted box. I tried to calm down. I put the box back in place, made sure all the lids were secure, and continued my work. My mind raced with thoughts about who might be in the building at that hour. Maybe a disgruntled employee had a key. Maybe a homeless person slipped in somehow. Every few minutes, I felt the urge to look behind me. I tried to keep my back against the wall whenever possible. It was making me jittery. Time crawled to around 3 in the morning. I decided to quit for the night. I powered down the computer, tidied up the area, and stepped back into the corridor. I looked at the restroom door. I noticed something new. A slight gap, maybe less than an inch wide, like the door was no longer fully closed. I stepped closer and saw that the lock was still in place, but the door seemed off-kilter, as if the frame had been damaged or shifted. I reached out and gently pushed. It didn't budge, but I felt a little give. I realized the door might have been tampered with. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't hear anything inside, but I felt certain someone was messing with that door. I had a sudden urge to yank it open, but I didn't have the key, and the lock was still intact from what I could tell. I took a few steps back. My heartbeat was loud. I swallowed hard, then walked straight to the elevator. My instincts told me to get out of there. When I reached the lobby, I told the receptionist that something felt wrong. She gave me a sympathetic look but said there was nothing she could do. Security was minimal at that hour, and as long as no alarm had gone off, they wouldn't search the basement. The next day, I spoke to my supervisor about the marks on the floor, the box that had been moved, and the restroom door. He said he'd look into it. He contacted maintenance. asked them if they'd been down there. No one claimed responsibility. The building's management told me they might send a maintenance person to check the restroom door soon, but they didn't promise anything about security patrols. They needed me to keep working on the digitizing project because there was a tight deadline. That night I arrived again, determined to finish faster. I had a strange feeling in my gut. I took the elevator down, stepped into the corridor, and turned on my flashlight before the overhead lights even came on. I scanned every inch of the walls and floor. I saw no footprints, no fresh marks. The door to the restroom still looked slightly misaligned. The archive door was locked, but I wondered if it had been tampered with. I unlocked it, walked in, and turned on the lights. The place looked the same as I'd left it. I sat at my desk, switched on the computer, and started scanning more documents. An hour passed without incident. Then around midnight, I heard a noise from the corridor. It sounded like a soft shuffle, then a dull thud. I froze in place. My neck tingled. I got up, grabbed my flashlight, and moved quietly toward the door. My pulse pounded. I pressed my ear against the metal. I could hear something faint, like someone was moving around out there. I didn't want to open the door and face whoever or whatever it was, but I felt cornered. There was no other exit from the archive except that one door. I kept listening. Another shuffle, then silence. I stood there for at least a minute, maybe longer. My breathing was shallow. I finally built up the courage to open the door. I held my flashlight in front of me, stepping into the corridor with my stomach knotted. I directed the beam to the left, toward the old restroom. The door was open about 3 inches. I could see the darkness beyond it, along with broken tiles on the restroom floor. There was a damp smell wafting from inside. I took one cautious step forward, but I didn't go any closer. I felt a chill run up my back. I could see fresh footprints in what looked like some kind of grime. They led in and out of that restroom. I thought about shouting or demanding that whoever was in there show themselves, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. Instead, I backed up slowly, keeping the flashlight on that doorway. Then I slipped back into the archive, locked the door behind me, and listened. My heart was beating so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I dialed the security desk on my phone. No one answered. I tried the main lobby desk. Still no answer. It was possible the receptionist had stepped away. I felt trapped. I had nowhere to go except the elevator at the other end of the corridor. But to reach it, I'd have to walk right past that restroom. I cursed under my breath, realizing I might be stuck there until morning unless I decided to make a run for it. I spent a solid 10 minutes pacing around the archive trying to decide. Finally, I grabbed my backpack, pulled out a small wrench I use for minor adjustments on the scanner, and held it in my hand. It wasn't much, but it gave me a sliver of confidence. With the wrench in one hand and my flashlight in the other, I unlocked the archive door and slipped out into the corridor again. The restroom door was still ajar, and I kept my flashlight aimed at it. I walked slowly, keeping as much distance as I could. My mouth felt dry. My palms were sweating. When I got near the elevator, I reached out and pressed the up button. The door took ages to open. I kept glancing toward the restroom. I thought I saw a slight movement, but it might have been a shadow. The corridor was dim and I couldn't be sure. At last, the elevator arrived. I backed in without turning around, keeping the light pointed toward the restroom. Then the doors slid shut. I jammed the button for the lobby. When I got up there, I looked around for the receptionist but didn't see her. I didn't stick around. I left the building in a hurry. On my way out, I called my supervisor, told him I wasn't staying another minute unless someone came down to check. He said he'd talk to management in the morning. That's where things stand now. I still don't know if someone's been camping out in that abandoned restroom or if it's something else entirely. All I know is I heard those footsteps more than once and I saw those footprints near the door. The lock looked damaged and the door was open one night. No one else has given me a good explanation. I'm not the kind of person who jumps at every noise, but this was different. Something is going on in that basement. I haven't gone back yet. The bank wants me to finish the project soon, but I asked for daytime hours until they can guarantee that the sublevel is secure. They haven't responded to my request. I keep wondering if they'll take it seriously or if they'll just assume it's in my head. But I know what I saw, and I know what I heard. I'm not stepping foot in that basement again unless someone else is with me or that restroom is sealed off for good. For now, I'm waiting. I still feel uneasy whenever I think about it. If it's a person lurking down there, I don't understand how they got in or why they would hang around. If it's something else, I don't want to know. All I can say is that nobody warned me about strange footsteps or open doors when I took this job. If someone did, I might have turned it down and saved myself a lot of sleepless days. But I guess that's what happens when you work nights in a place no one else wants to be. I just hope they sort it out before something worse happens, whatever worse might be. I still feel a knot in my stomach when I remember that attic. Back then, I thought old buildings just made weird noises at night. I never imagined I'd end up climbing into a dark, dusty space, calling out to something I didn't understand. But that's what happened. I can't prove I heard a person up there, but my gut tells me it wasn't just the wind or the old wood creaking. Here's what happened. I moved into that apartment because it was cheap. It was an old 3-story building with wide hallways and a stone facade. They said it was built in the 1920s, and it looked like it might have been a hotel once. The landlord told me it had a long history of different owners. He mentioned there was an attic, but he didn't say anything else about it. The place smelled musty, and the floors groaned when anyone walked. My new roommate, Lucas, didn't care about any of that. He liked the cheap rent and the big living room. We shook hands on splitting the cost and moved in our furniture within a week. On the first night, I realized how loud the building could be. Every step in the corridor echoed through the walls. At around midnight, I heard a series of pops and cracks, almost like someone tapping on a thin wooden board. I tried not to think about it. The building was old. Wood expands or contracts or something like that. Lucas didn't seem bothered at all. He said he'd lived in older places and was used to those kinds of noises. I shrugged and told myself I'd get used to it too. After a couple of weeks, I started to notice a particular sound during the late hours. It was always around 2 or 3 in the morning, never earlier. I'd wake up because of these light thumps right above me. My bedroom was on the top floor, so above me was the attic. At first I thought it might be birds or rats scurrying around. The landlord had warned us there might be pigeons nesting near the roof, and I assumed that explained it. But it didn't really sound like animals. It sounded like footsteps. I didn't tell Lucas right away because I knew what he'd say. It's just the pipes or the wind. Finally, after a few nights of this, I decided to mention it to him. We were in the kitchen and I said, "Dude, I hear footsteps at night right above my bed." He laughed a little and told me he'd heard squeaks in the walls too, but it was just the building. I insisted it sounded like someone walking. He smirked and said, "Someone would need a key to get into the attic, and the landlord keeps that locked." He made a joke about ghosts. I rolled my eyes. I'm not a believer in supernatural stuff, so I just let it go. Then one morning, I walked into the hallway near our front door and saw dirty footprints on the floor. They looked fresh. The prints were dark and smeared along the edges, almost like someone had walked through some dusty area and then stepped onto our clean floor. The shoes looked pretty large, maybe a size bigger than mine. The footprints went straight down the corridor and stopped near the small wooden door in the ceiling that led to the attic's crawl space. I stood there staring at them. I felt a rush of adrenaline in my chest because I didn't have an explanation. As far as I knew, the only people on our floor were me and Lucas. There was an older couple down the hall, but their door was closed and it was early. I doubt they stomped around in dirty shoes late at night. I followed the footprints, but they faded out as they got closer to the attic door. There was a cheap padlock on it, the kind that might come with a basement storage unit. I reached up and tested it. The lock was still there, but it looked old and rusted. I didn't see any damage on it, no broken hasp or anything like that. I remember standing on my toes trying to peer into the gap between the door and the frame. It was pitch black. That day I waited for Lucas to come home. He got in from work around 6, and I pulled him into the hallway right away. I pointed at the footprints. They were still visible, though they'd started to fade because people had stepped over them. Lucas squinted and said, "That's weird," then offered a shrug. I asked him if he'd heard anything that night or if he knew someone with an attic key. He shook his head. He also pointed out that people sometimes track in dirt from outside. It wasn't unusual in an old building with a filthy entrance area. I tried to argue that it made no sense for them to lead straight to the attic door. He just repeated that it wasn't a big deal. For the next few days, I tried to ignore it. I wanted to believe there was a simple explanation. Maybe the footprints belonged to some repair guy who came earlier. Maybe he had a key. I reminded myself that I hadn't spoken to the landlord in a while. He might have let someone inside to check on the roof. Life went on. Lucas and I went to work during the day, hung out in the evening, and I tried not to dwell on the noises above my bedroom. But one weekend, Lucas decided to visit his family in another state. He left early on a Saturday morning, telling me he'd be back Sunday night. I spent that Saturday doing laundry, watching TV, and grabbing takeout for dinner. The building was quieter than usual because several neighbors seemed to be out as well. When I went to bed around midnight, I felt a little uneasy. There was an eerie silence in the hallway, and I kept thinking about the footsteps overhead. But I managed to fall asleep. At around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a loud scraping noise. It sounded like a heavy piece of furniture being dragged across a rough floor. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. My first thought was that it was coming from right above me, where the attic was. I listened closely, and I heard something that sounded like intermittent shuffling. It would start, then stop, then start again. It was too loud to be a pigeon or a rat. My mouth felt dry, and my arms felt tingly from the rush of fear. I swung my legs out of bed and stood up, trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to just put on headphones and ignore it, but another part of me was furious. If someone was sneaking around up there, that felt like a violation of my space. I walked to the bedroom door and peeked into the hallway. It was dark, but a small lamp in the corner provided a dim yellow glow. I opened the door fully and stepped out. The corridor was empty. There was no one at the far end by the stairs. I walked slowly toward the attic hatch. The building was silent except for the sound coming from above. Every few seconds I heard a muffled thump, like something brushing against the floor. I paused under the attic door. I could see it was slightly ajar. The padlock was hanging from the latch, but the latch was undone. It looked like whoever had gone up there hadn't bothered to lock it again. My heart was racing. My palms were sweaty. I wondered if I should call the landlord or the cops, but I felt stupid doing that without checking first. Adrenaline took over. I pulled a small folding stool from the hallway corner. There was an old stool people used to reach high shelves. I set it up under the attic hatch. My legs felt shaky as I climbed on top. The hatch was just at eye level now. I lifted the door a bit more and stuck my head through the opening, trying to see. The attic was dark. A faint smell of dust and old wood hit me in the face. I couldn't see much, just the outline of a few beams and stacks of random junk. I stayed quiet for a second, listening. Then I heard a quick movement, like someone shifting in place. I felt my heart hammering in my chest. My mind raced with all sorts of possibilities. Maybe a squatter, maybe someone from the building storing stuff illegally, maybe just an animal. I swallowed hard and called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" I froze. There was a rustling sound, like someone pulling back or stepping away. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make it clear it wasn't just an empty space. I realized I was alone in the apartment, with no backup. My chest felt tight, and I was gripping the edge of the hatch so hard my knuckles turned white. I took a quick breath and said, "You're not supposed to be up here." My voice cracked a bit. Again, just silence. Then a faint shuffle. It sounded like whoever or whatever it was moved away from me. I felt this intense urge to get the hell out of there. My instincts told me this was wrong, that I should back off. My legs were trembling. I climbed down from the stool as quietly as I could. My hands shook when I reached up and pulled the hatch door down. I slid the latch back in place and fumbled with the padlock, clicking it shut. I didn't even want to look through the gap to see if anyone was staring back at me. I stood there for a moment, pressing my ear against the wooden door. I could hear nothing. No furniture dragging, no footsteps, just silence. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I turned and walked back to my room. My mind was racing. Part of me wanted to run out of the apartment and call the police. Another part of me felt embarrassed about the idea of showing up outside in my pajamas and explaining I thought someone was living in my attic. I locked my bedroom door even though I knew that wouldn't help if there was some hidden entrance. I sat on my bed for the rest of the night, wide awake, just listening. Eventually, I fell asleep from exhaustion. The next morning, I woke up with the sun coming through the window. My neck was sore from the awkward position I'd slept in. I walked out to the hallway. The attic door was still closed, still locked. I glanced around the corridor. No new footprints. No weird smells. It looked normal except for that stool still sitting under the hatch. I felt uneasy about staying there alone another night. I tried calling Lucas, but he was on the road and didn't pick up. I decided to head out. I went to a cafe for breakfast and spent most of the day wandering around trying to distract myself. My phone stayed quiet, and I tried not to think about the events of the night before. In the late afternoon, I came back to the apartment to grab some things. The building was busy again. Neighbors were returning. Someone was dragging a suitcase up the stairs. Everything seemed ordinary. I stepped into our place, looked around, and nothing was out of place. I tiptoed down the hallway and checked the attic door. It was still locked. I exhaled, feeling some relief. Lucas returned that evening. I told him what happened. He stared at me for a moment and said, "That's crazy. Are you sure you weren't half asleep?" I told him no. I was wide awake. He joked about me having an overactive imagination, but said if I really heard someone, we should report it to the landlord. We did, but the landlord just said he was the only one with a key, and he never went up there. He also said the lock had been there for years, and he had no reason to open the attic. He suggested it could be stray cats or large birds. We never found any proof that someone was living up there. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd confronted a real person that night. Sometimes I'd still hear faint sounds coming from the attic, but I never tried to open it again. When something would shift above me late at night, I'd force myself to think about wind or pipes or pigeons. I never saw new footprints after that weekend. I stayed another 5 months before moving out. Lucas thought I was overreacting, but I couldn't feel comfortable there anymore. Even now, when I think about that place, I remember how I felt standing on that stool, peering into the dark. I can still feel the tension in my arms and the tightness in my chest. It's one thing to hear creaks and assume it's the building settling. It's another thing to open the attic hatch and hear a person shifting around in the shadows. I never found out who they were or what they were doing up there. But every time I hear an unexplained noise in an old building, my mind goes straight back to that attic door and the moment I realized I wasn't alone. I wish I had a clean answer, but I don't. All I know is that I locked the attic hatch that night, and I'm pretty sure something up there wanted it to stay unlocked. I noticed something was off as soon as I walked through the main doors. The hotel lobby had an odd smell, like old carpet and polish. The walls looked worn, and the bell on the front desk had scratches on its surface. It wasn't filthy, but it felt stale. There was a single light flickering near the corridor, and it gave me the sense that I was stepping into a place caught in some weird time loop. The front desk clerk was polite, but he looked bored, and I got the key to my room without any conversation. I was there for a work event in another state, and I just wanted a bed to crash on and enough space to go over my notes before my presentations. I didn't expect anything special from the hotel, but I also didn't expect what ended up happening. I checked in around 7 at night. My suitcase was small. I had one garment bag with my suits, and I carried a laptop in a backpack. The lobby ceiling was high, and the lighting was a mix of warm lamps and cold fluorescent bulbs. The floor made a creaking noise under my shoes. I saw a few people sitting in the lounge area near some large windows. An older couple was sipping coffee. A younger woman was tapping on her phone. And there was this one guy by the reception desk who caught my eye. He was taller than me, probably about 6'2", and he looked strong. I could see the outline of his broad shoulders under a wrinkled gray suit jacket. He had a thick neck and his tie was loose. I tried to look away, but he made eye contact. He stared at me for a few seconds, and then he seemed to glance at my luggage. I felt a slight rush of nerves, but I wrote it off as nothing. I headed up to my room on the 3rd floor. The elevator was small, with a mirror on one side and a scuffed metal panel for the buttons. The inside smelled like disinfectant. When the doors opened on my floor, the hallway lights were dim and gave everything a yellowish tint. The carpet looked worn, with a few stains here and there. My room, 307, was near the end. I fumbled with the key for a moment before getting the door open. Inside, the layout was normal. A small closet to the left, the bathroom door on the right, and the bed a few steps forward. The bedspread was a dull shade of green. The room looked old, but it was clean enough. I set down my bags and took a breath. I decided to change into casual clothes and head out to grab some dinner. I left my room about half an hour later. As soon as I stepped into the hallway, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see who it was, and it was that same guy from the lobby. He was at the other end of the corridor, just standing there. He didn't say anything, and I felt uneasy. I tried to act normal, so I locked my door and walked to the elevator. I noticed he was walking too, maintaining a slow pace behind me. When I pressed the button for the elevator, I stood there waiting for what felt like a long time. The elevator dinged and opened. I stepped in, and so did he. He stayed right by the door, and I went to the opposite corner. I could see his reflection in the elevator mirror. He had a scruffy beard and tired eyes. There was a slight scent of stale cologne, and it made me a bit nauseous. Neither of us spoke. He kept his hands by his sides. I watched the floor numbers light up one by one. Finally, we reached the lobby. I got out first. He lingered, but still followed me after a second. I walked quickly through the lobby and headed out into the street, pretending I was in a hurry. I could hear his footsteps behind me for a moment, but then they faded. I glanced back once before crossing the street, and I saw him standing in front of the hotel's revolving doors. He didn't wave or call out. He just watched me. That night, I had a simple meal at a nearby diner. My stomach felt tight and I couldn't relax. I kept replaying the moment in the elevator. I told myself it might be a coincidence. Maybe he was just another guest, checking out the local restaurants or something similar. By the time I got back, around 10, the lobby was nearly empty. I didn't see him. I went straight up to my room. I locked the door, slid the chain in place, and pushed the small table against it just to be safe. I slept, but it was restless sleep. The next day, I had meetings and a small presentation. I tried to focus on my work. I told myself the guy was probably harmless. The hotel was old and might not have many floors open to guests, so it made sense we'd cross paths. But I stayed alert. I spent the morning at a conference room in a building a few blocks away. During lunch, I chatted with a few colleagues, but I never mentioned what happened. It didn't sound serious enough to bring up, and I didn't want to seem paranoid. I finished work around 6 p.m. and returned to the hotel. As I walked in, I looked around the lobby. I didn't see him. I breathed a small sigh of relief. I went to the front desk to ask about local places to eat. The clerk gave me a few suggestions, and then I took the elevator back up. Right when I stepped out on my floor, I saw him at the far end of the hallway again. He wasn't wearing his jacket this time, just a wrinkled dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up. I froze for a second. My room was only a few doors down, and I decided to keep walking. I could feel him staring at me. My heart rate picked up and my palms started to sweat. As I reached my door, I didn't hear him moving, but I felt his eyes on my back. I quickly unlocked my door, slipped inside and shut it. I locked it as fast as I could, then leaned against it. After a few seconds, I heard heavy footsteps walking away. I pressed my ear to the door and listened. Nothing else. I exhaled in relief, but my hands were shaking. I stayed in that night. I ordered takeout and tried to watch TV. The signal was spotty, and the channels looked fuzzy on the old television. Around 10, I tried to go to sleep. I heard some doors opening and closing in the hallway, but I couldn't tell if it was him. I got up a few times to look through the peephole, but I only saw an empty hallway. Eventually, I managed to doze off. In the middle of the night, I had this sudden jolt, like someone had slammed a door, but then I realized it was my own imagination. When morning came, I felt exhausted. The second day of my conference went well. After finishing around 5, a small group invited me to dinner. I wanted to refuse, but I also didn't want to go back to that hotel early. I agreed and spent a couple of hours at a local restaurant, talking about work-related stuff and having a quick meal. I tried to seem normal, but every time the door opened or someone passed by, I glanced up. I was jumpy. The food went down like sand and I barely tasted anything. By the time I got back to the hotel that night, it was past 10. I passed through the lobby and noticed it was nearly deserted. Only one worker sat behind the front desk, and she was looking at a computer screen. As I headed to the elevator, I told myself it would be fine. It was late. He might be asleep. But as soon as I pressed the button, I had a weird feeling. The elevator took a while to come down. I stepped inside and pressed 3. The doors started to close, then a hand shot in, forcing them to reopen. I jumped back. It was him. He looked sweaty, like he'd been pacing around. He got in without saying anything. I stared at the floor. My chest felt tight. The elevator rose in complete silence. When it reached my floor, I hurried out. He followed, just a few steps behind. The hallway felt even darker than before. I could hear him breathing. He was that close. My room door was about 10 feet away. I fumbled with the key, trying to keep my hand steady. He stopped behind me. I felt my neck prickle. My breath got shallow. I unlocked the door, pushed it open, and quickly slipped inside. I slammed it shut and turned the lock. My heart was pounding so hard that I could hear my pulse. Outside, I heard his footsteps moving away, slow and heavy. I didn't sleep much that night. I laid on my bed, fully dressed, with the lamp on. Every tiny noise in the hallway made me sit up. I checked the time on my phone repeatedly. Around 2 in the morning, I thought I heard something near my door, like a faint tapping, but it could have been the pipes or some other guest. I was too scared to look through the peephole again. My stomach felt unsettled, and I had a slight headache. I kept replaying the last 2 nights, wondering if I should call the front desk or maybe even call the police. But he hadn't threatened me or done anything more than follow me. I wasn't sure if it was enough to involve the authorities. I decided to wait until morning and see if maybe this was some misunderstanding. On the 3rd night, I tried a different approach. I finished my work tasks earlier and went out to dinner with a colleague. We wrapped up around 8, and I took a cab back to the hotel. I told myself I would check in with the front desk if anything felt off. But when I got to my floor, I saw him right away. He was leaning against the wall near my room with his arms crossed. He looked directly at me. The hallway light flickered, and I saw a faint grin on his face. It made my skin crawl. I paused. He didn't move. He just stared for a moment, then spoke. His voice was low and raspy. He asked if I was ready to talk. That's all he said. He kept his eyes on me, and I noticed sweat on his forehead. I gripped the handle of my suitcase tightly. I shook my head and mumbled, "No," then walked past him, making sure to keep my back against the opposite wall. My heart hammered. I felt a rush of adrenaline. I thought he might grab my arm or block me, but he let me walk by. He didn't follow me to my door. I slid the key in, opened it, and slammed it shut. Then I pressed my ear to the door again. I heard him chuckle, a low sound that made me even more nervous. After a few seconds, his footsteps echoed down the hallway. I stayed up most of that night too. I watched TV with the volume low. I tried to distract myself by browsing social media, but my hands were shaky and I kept looking at the door. I considered calling someone for help, but I wasn't sure what to say. The hotel was old and maybe they didn't have security cameras. Maybe they did. Either way, I felt stuck. I put a chair under the doorknob, not sure if that would help. Every so often I glanced outside through the peephole, but the hallway was empty. I had to give one more short presentation the next morning, so I tried to get at least a few hours of sleep. I managed a bit, but it was the kind of sleep where you dream about the exact thing you're worried about. I woke up around 6 a.m., groggy and anxious. I got dressed and left the room around 7 a.m., double-checking the corridor before stepping out. No sign of him. I headed to the lobby, did my presentation at the conference site, and then made a quick decision. I told my boss I needed to leave early. I lied, saying I had a personal emergency. Nobody asked questions. By noon, I went back to the hotel, packed my things, and checked out ahead of schedule. At the front desk, I avoided looking around. I just wanted to leave. The clerk asked if everything was okay, and I said yes. I rolled my suitcase out the front doors, grabbed a cab, and left. I felt relief as soon as the taxi pulled away. My shoulders dropped a little, and I took a deep breath. I stared at that old building until it disappeared from view. Part of me wondered if he saw me leave. But I didn't care anymore. I just wanted to get on a plane and go home. I was tired, drained, and a bit embarrassed that I never told anyone what was going on. I still don't know why he followed me or what he wanted to talk about. Maybe he mistook me for someone else. Maybe he was waiting for the right moment to do something worse. I don't know. I just know that I'm never staying in a place like that again. If I ever travel for work in that region, I'll do whatever it takes to book a modern hotel with a reliable front desk staff. I'm done taking chances. That's the whole story. I left early and I never looked back. I told a few co-workers about it later, but I didn't go into detail. They laughed it off or said it sounded creepy, but I don't think they got how tense it felt. It's not the kind of thing you understand unless you've been followed by someone who acts like that. I still think about it sometimes, usually when I'm waiting for an elevator alone at night. I listen for footsteps, check reflections, and keep a key in my hand. I don't want to be caught off guard like that again. It was a strange few days that taught me to trust my gut. When something feels wrong, I'm not going to ignore it. I'm not going to hesitate. I'll get out as fast as I can. I felt a slight rush of adrenaline when I turned off the main road and headed down that narrow street. The pavement looked cracked and uneven, and the streetlights flickered in random intervals. I had never been to that part of town before. The invitation mentioned a small get-together in a bar on the outskirts, and I knew I was running late. Work had kept me longer than I planned, so I arrived when the sky was already dark. As I parked near the side of the bar, I noticed one old car and a couple of motorcycles lined up. The building had a faded sign and one weak light bulb above the entrance. It didn't look welcoming, but I didn't want to bail on the invitation. I decided to step inside and check it out. I pushed the door open and felt a slight pressure in my chest as I took in my surroundings. The place was dim and mostly quiet. A single pool table stood in one corner, and a few people leaned against it, chatting in low voices. The bar counter stretched along the left side, with a tired-looking bartender wiping glasses. I saw only a handful of other patrons, mostly sitting at small tables. They seemed focused on their own conversations. No one looked in my direction, at least not at first. I took a few steps forward and felt the sticky floor under my shoes. The smell of stale beer and cheap disinfectant hung in the air. I spotted a free stool at the bar and sat down. I waited for the bartender to notice me. She walked over with a neutral expression and asked what I wanted. I asked for a beer, something simple. She cracked open a cold bottle and handed it to me without a word. I took a sip and glanced around. There wasn't any music playing. The only sounds were muffled conversations and the occasional clack of pool balls. My pulse still beat a bit faster than normal, but I tried to relax. I told myself it was just a late evening in a strange place. I wasn't doing anything wrong. I figured the worst-case scenario was that I'd stay for one drink and leave if things felt off. After a few minutes, I heard the front door open again. I glanced over my shoulder, but it was just someone stepping outside for a smoke. The place felt isolated. The event I was invited to didn't seem like much of an event at all. I saw maybe 10 people scattered around, none of them dressed up or appearing to celebrate anything. I rubbed the back of my neck and wondered if I should have stayed home. The silence made me uneasy. Nobody approached me. I kept sipping my beer and checking my phone, though the signal was weak. I could sense the bartender glancing my way once in a while, probably out of boredom. I lost track of time for a bit, staring at the wall. Then I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I turned around and noticed a guy on the other side of the room watching me. He stood near a corner table, leaning against it, his eyes fixed on me. He didn't blink much, and he made no attempt to hide his interest. I looked away, trying not to show that his stare bothered me. I took another sip of beer and tried to ignore it, but I could still feel his eyes on me. After a minute, I glanced his way again. He was still watching. I felt my stomach tighten. I thought about just leaving, but I had barely touched my drink. I hoped he would shift his attention to someone else, but he didn't. He took a few steps closer, paused, and then came even closer. He slid into a stool about 2 seats away from me. He kept his head turned in my direction, that same strange smile on his face. I heard him clear his throat like he was about to speak, but then he just grinned and tapped his fingers on the bar. I tried to act casual. I gave him a small nod, not wanting to provoke anything. He stared at me for a few more seconds, then leaned closer. He spoke in a low voice, but his tone had a forced friendliness. He asked if I wanted to try something special, something on the house. He said he had access to a special drink the bartender kept for certain friends. I tried to sound polite when I declined, saying I was good with my beer. His smile faded for a moment, and I noticed he kept one hand in his jacket pocket the entire time. He insisted again, telling me it was a brinde de casa. He used those exact words, which felt odd coming from him in English. I repeated that I wasn't interested, but he shook his head like I was making a big mistake. He leaned in even closer and said, "It's not wise to refuse gifts." His tone was sharper this time. I took a slow breath. My palms felt damp. I looked at the bartender, but she was busy on the far side of the bar, not paying attention. The few other patrons were lost in their own little worlds, murmuring or staring off into space. This guy was too close, and I could see the tension in his jaw. I glanced at his pocket. He kept it hidden, but I could tell he was gripping something. I couldn't see what it was, but my gut told me it wasn't just a phone or a wallet. I felt a chill run through me. My thoughts scattered. I didn't want to start a confrontation. I also didn't want to drink something he gave me. I started to think about ways to leave without causing a scene. I murmured that I had to step outside for a moment to check a message. He stared at me and smirked. He told me not to be gone too long. I slid off the stool, left my half-finished beer there, and headed for the exit. My breath caught in my chest the moment I stepped outside. The air felt cool against my face, but my heart kept hammering. I knew I should just get in my car and drive away. I glanced back through the window. He was standing by the bar watching me. I saw his silhouette. My hands trembled a bit as I fumbled for my car keys. I tried to calm down, telling myself that maybe he was just messing around, but something about his expression told me this was serious. I didn't want to gamble. I got the door of my car open, slid into the driver's seat, and started the engine. Then, right as I was about to pull away, I heard the bar door swing open. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw him standing there, still with that odd smile, his hand in his pocket. He didn't shout or run after me. He just stared, as if he was daring me to come back. The hairs on my arms stood on end. I sped out of that parking lot without looking back, nearly hitting a pothole on my way to the main road. Once I reached a better lit area, I exhaled and realized I had been holding my breath. My mind raced. I kept thinking about how he said, "It's not wise to refuse gifts." I wondered what he meant by that. The tone of his voice didn't sound like a normal invitation or a casual offer. It felt like a threat. I had a dozen thoughts swirling around. Did he work for someone? Was he just a thug trying to push drugs on me? Did he have a weapon in his pocket? The way he whispered, "Volte otra hora, estaré te esperando," kept repeating in my head. It was Portuguese, but I got the sense of what he meant. He was telling me to come back, and that he would be waiting. I felt another wave of unease. I drove for a few minutes, then pulled into a gas station parking lot to breathe and collect myself. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel. I couldn't believe that tiny gathering turned out so strange. I dialed my friend who had invited me, but the call went straight to voicemail. I left a short message saying the bar was weird and that I didn't feel safe. Then I sat there, staring at the gas station lights. I wondered if I should call the police, but I didn't have enough to report. The guy didn't actually harm me or show a weapon. I had no evidence of a crime besides intimidation. I decided to just go home. I felt safer once I was back on the main road. When I got to my apartment, I parked and hurried inside. My body still felt tense, and my throat felt dry. I locked my door and checked the windows. Then I tossed my keys on the kitchen table and took off my jacket. My mind replayed the whole scene. The bar's dim lighting, the sticky floor, that man's stare, his hand hidden in his pocket, the way his voice dropped when he insisted I try his special drink. I remembered how few people were there. Nobody else seemed concerned or even aware of what was happening. The bartender was either clueless or didn't care. I paced around my living room, trying to calm down. I couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened if I had stayed. I imagined worst-case scenarios like him pulling out a gun or slipping something into my drink. The only thing I felt sure about was that leaving when I did was the right move. I picked up my phone, scrolled through social media, tried to distract myself. Nothing worked. My shoulders felt tight, and I could feel a dull ache in my lower back. I realized I was still running on adrenaline. Eventually, I took a quick shower, then lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face or heard his voice telling me to come back. I sat up a few times, checking my phone, wondering if anyone had tried to reach me. No new messages. I typed a long text to my friend, explaining everything in detail. I wanted them to know how uncomfortable it was. I ended up erasing half of it before I hit send, because I sounded too rattled. I didn't want to seem paranoid, but I kept the main points. Weird bar. Unsettling guy. I had to leave. The next morning, I woke up feeling groggy. I still had that feeling of unease in my chest. My phone had a missed call from my friend, but no voicemail. I hesitated to call back because I didn't have much time before heading to work. I grabbed a quick coffee at home, but it tasted bitter. My stomach was in knots, and I had no appetite for breakfast. On the drive to the office, I kept replaying the encounter. Every detail felt more ominous in the light of day. I tried turning on the radio to break the tension, but every song felt grating. At work, I tried to focus on my tasks. I felt jumpy every time my phone buzzed. I got a few texts from my friend, apologizing for the weird situation. They said they left early and didn't see anything unusual, but they admitted the place might have been a bad choice. That didn't help me much. I wrote back, saying I wasn't upset with them, but that I didn't want to go back there ever again. My coworker noticed I was on edge, but I just said I had a rough night. As the day wore on, the tension in my shoulders eased a little, but the memory of that guy still lingered. I kept picturing the way he stared, the odd grin, the hand in his pocket. I also remembered how deserted the bar felt. I started to wonder why so few people showed up for that get-together. Maybe other guests left early because something about that place was off. Or maybe they never came. I had too many questions and no real answers. By the time I clocked out, I felt a headache coming on. On my drive home, I took a different route, partly because of traffic, but also because I didn't want to pass anywhere near that bar. The thought of seeing that man again made my chest tighten. I couldn't forget his final words. Volte a otra hora. Estarei te esperando. It wasn't a friendly invitation. It felt like a promise or a warning. My mouth felt dry whenever I remembered his voice. I got home and locked the door again, like I did the night before. I realized I was overthinking everything, but I couldn't help it. The tension felt real. My phone buzzed with a few random notifications, but nothing related to that night. I tried to relax by watching some mindless TV. I couldn't focus on the show. My thoughts drifted to the bar's dim lights and that strange smell of old beer. I could almost taste the stale air again. It's been a few days since then, and I still feel uneasy. I haven't driven anywhere near that area, and I don't plan to. I haven't heard from that guy, but I keep expecting something to happen. It's like I'm waiting for a knock on my door or a phone call from an unknown number. I know it sounds paranoid, but I can't shake the feeling that he meant what he said. I keep replaying the moment he leaned in and whispered, "It's not wise to refuse gifts." I think about how he wouldn't take his hand out of his pocket. I wonder what he was hiding. I'm just glad I made it out without finding out. I don't plan on going back. That's one promise I made to myself. If someone invites me to a shady bar in the middle of nowhere, I'll make an excuse and stay home. I still feel a shiver when I remember the last thing he said to me. I don't want any trouble. I don't need to prove anything to anyone. I just know I'm never stepping foot in that bar again. When I think about that night, I feel my heartbeat pick up, and I get this cold sweat on my forehead. Sometimes I wonder if I'm overreacting. But then I remember his stare, his smirk, and the pressure of his hand in that pocket. I can't forget that, and I don't want to find out what would happen if I accepted his gift. I still remember the glare of those headlights and the way my stomach tightened at the thought of not making it home. It was almost 11 at night. The road was empty, no streetlights, no steady flow of cars, just me, my sedan, and whatever was lurking in the darkness behind me. I had taken a secondary highway to avoid tolls and heavy traffic. I never expected to feel so alone out there, but that's exactly how it happened. By the end of it, I was sitting in a 24-hour gas station with my hands shaking on the counter, wondering if I'd just run into an angry driver or someone who had worse plans. I had left work later than usual. I was exhausted from a long day, but I wanted to get back to my place without sitting in bumper-to-bumper traffic or dealing with the high tolls. Taking the back roads seemed like a perfect plan. I'd driven on this particular route before, though always during the day. At night, it was a whole different story. The asphalt stretched ahead in long, straight segments, broken only by the occasional curve that never felt too sharp. There were no overhead lights. There were patches of farmland on each side, with fences that were barely visible except when my headlights swept over them. Sometimes I saw silhouettes of buildings in the distance, but they were few and far between. I had the radio on at a low volume. I wasn't listening to anything special, just a local station playing old rock songs. The road noise was hypnotic. The hum of the engine made me a bit drowsy, so I kept the windows cracked. The cool air on my face was enough to keep me awake. I felt relaxed but alert. My hands were steady on the wheel, and I thought the drive would be completely uneventful. Around 11 o'clock, I noticed a glow in my rearview mirror. At first, it was just a faint light far behind me. I thought it was a truck or maybe an SUV. On this kind of road, sometimes trucks hauled goods at night, trying to skip the busier highways. But something about the speed of the light caught my attention. It wasn't moving steadily. It surged closer, then seemed to slow, then rushed forward again. It was odd, but I shrugged it off and kept driving. I figured maybe the driver was just adjusting their speed. A minute later, those headlights were right behind me. My car was suddenly lit up. They were using high beams, and it felt like they wanted me to notice them. I checked my speedometer. I wasn't driving too slow. I was going around the speed limit, maybe a little over. There was no reason to tailgate me. I signaled to the right, hoping to let them pass. There were 2 lanes in each direction, and the road was deserted. They could easily switch lanes and go around me, but they didn't. I eased onto the right lane. The car followed. It stayed right on my bumper, and I caught glimpses of their headlights bouncing in my mirror. I tried slowing down, hoping they would get annoyed and pass. Instead, they stayed behind me, still bright lights in my mirror. After a few moments, I nudged my car back into the left lane. They followed again, matching my move. They were so close I couldn't see their license plate. I rolled down my window and waved my arm, gesturing for them to go ahead. I thought maybe they were confused or wanted to ask for directions. Nobody else was around, and sometimes drivers do weird things at night if they're lost. But they didn't pass. Their beams switched to a rapid flicker. On, off, like they were trying to send a signal. It was distracting and painful to look at. My heart started pounding. I told myself to stay calm. Maybe this guy was just messing around. Some people do that. They see a single driver on the road and decide to harass them for fun. I took a deep breath and tried to keep my focus on the road ahead. The next exit sign was a few miles away. I decided to pick up speed and lose them. I pressed my foot down on the accelerator and watched the speedometer climb. The engine got louder. The lines on the road blurred by faster. But when I peeked at the mirror, those headlights were still there, close enough to blind me. Sweat formed on the back of my neck. The driver behind me seemed to anticipate every move I made. I tried switching lanes randomly, braking slightly, accelerating again. Nothing helped. They stayed stuck on me. I felt a knot in my stomach. The quiet road, the darkness outside, and those glaring lights were all I could think about. My hands got slippery on the steering wheel, and my ears started to ring. I wanted to get off the highway as soon as possible. Finally, I saw a sign for a 24-hour gas station at the next exit. I recognized it as one of those old stations that never closes. They usually have a small convenience store, a bathroom, and maybe a single attendant at the register. I figured if someone was there, I could ask for help. Even if it was just another driver filling up, it was better than staying alone on the road with this maniac behind me. I took the exit ramp, slowing down to make the curve. The headlights stayed close. They didn't hesitate to follow me. My pulse quickened. My eyes were wide, and my mouth was dry. The ramp led onto a small road that connected to the gas station. It was maybe half a mile away, a short stretch with one street light near the station entrance. I hoped that once we got off the highway, this driver would pass or leave me alone. But they remained glued to my rear. As I approached the gas station's lot, I could see the bright fluorescent lights over the pumps. There was a single car at one of the pumps, but it looked empty. I guessed the driver was inside the store. I pulled in and parked next to the store entrance. The other car didn't pull into the station. It rolled onto the shoulder of the road across from the station and turned off its headlights. My chest felt tight. I stared at that car through the station's window, but it was hard to see any details in the darkness. It was just a dark shape sitting there. No engine noise, no lights, nothing. I opened my door and stepped out. My legs were shaky, and my heart thumped in my chest. The air smelled like gasoline, and the pavement was damp from a recent drizzle. I could hear the buzzing from the overhead lighting. I went into the store. The door beeped when I walked in, and the clerk, a middle-aged guy with a cap, looked up from his phone. He seemed bored and not at all concerned. "Hey," I said, trying to steady my voice. "Is there anybody else around here?" I glanced behind me, then back at him. "There's a car parked across the road. It followed me and then stopped out there." He shrugged. "Haven't seen anything. Been quiet all night." I walked to the window to peek outside. I could still see the shape of the other car on the shoulder. My palms were sweating. I wondered if I should call the police, but I didn't see an immediate crime. They just rode my bumper for miles. High beams, flashing lights, all that. The clerk raised an eyebrow. "Could be some jerk, or maybe somebody thinks they know you." I snorted a laugh, but it came out shaky. "I doubt that. I just need to wait a few minutes and see if they leave." The clerk nodded. "Suit yourself. You want something to drink?" I grabbed a bottle of water from the cooler. My throat felt tight. I paid for it and stood near the counter, taking a few small sips. The station was dead quiet besides us. The overhead speakers were playing some low-volume music, barely audible. I was too distracted to make out the words. My mind kept returning to that car across the road. I wanted to look, but I also worried about drawing attention. After a couple of minutes, I mustered the courage to step back outside. I walked around the front of my car and tried to act natural, but I felt like I was in a spotlight. The fluorescent lights above the station were harsh, and I imagined whoever was in that car could see me plainly. I glanced toward the road. The vehicle was still there, headlights off, engine silent. I couldn't see anyone inside. I considered driving off, but I didn't want to risk it. What if they followed me again? What if something worse happened? I decided to fill my gas tank. My hands trembled while I swiped my card. The pump clicked, and the smell of gas filled my nostrils. I kept looking over my shoulder at that car. The tension made my stomach churn. My heart was beating so loudly I could feel it in my ears. After finishing, I slid the nozzle back and replaced the gas cap. Then I lingered near the door of my car, trying to decide what to do next. A few more minutes passed. I went inside again to ask if the clerk had a back exit or something. He said, "There's only one way in or out for customers." I could tell he thought I was overreacting. He kept glancing at his phone, probably hoping I would calm down. But I felt uneasy. I paced around, occasionally sipping my water. Finally, I realized I had no real choice but to leave at some point. I couldn't spend the entire night there. The tension was exhausting. I took a deep breath and decided to check if that car was still in the same spot. I stepped outside once more and looked across the road. This time, the car was gone. My heartbeat didn't slow down right away. I scanned the road, but it was empty. Nothing moved under the dim glow of the single streetlight. The asphalt was still wet in patches, reflecting the station's lights. The farmland behind the road was silent. I walked around my car to see if maybe the mystery vehicle had pulled around to a different spot, but I saw no sign of it. The shoulder was empty. I stared at the darkness for a few seconds, waiting for headlights to flick on. Nothing happened. The road stayed silent. I exhaled and felt some relief wash over me. My shoulders dropped and my heartbeat eased back to a more normal rhythm. I stepped into the station one last time and told the clerk, "I guess they took off." He shrugged. "Maybe they got bored. You good?" I nodded. "Yeah, I think so. Thanks." He didn't say much else, and I didn't blame him. It was late, and he had probably seen stranger things during night shifts. I walked back outside, got in my car, and turned on the engine. The dashboard lights glowed, and the hum of the engine felt comforting. I glanced at the road again. Still no other vehicles in sight. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the gas station, checking my rearview mirror over and over. For the next several miles, I kept expecting to see those headlights appear behind me again. My anxiety level was high. My shoulders felt tense, and I occasionally found myself gripping the wheel too hard. A few times I thought I saw a glow in the distance, but it never turned into a real car. It was probably just my eyes playing tricks on me. The road was quiet, and soon the only lights were from occasional houses or small businesses closed for the night. By the time I reached the main highway again, my nerves had calmed down, but I was still on edge. I turned onto the wider road, where a few trucks and cars passed by. The presence of other drivers felt comforting. At least I wasn't alone. I finally made it home around midnight, parked in my driveway, and sat in the car for a few minutes before going inside. My heart was still beating fast, and I wiped some sweat from my forehead. I checked around my street to make sure nobody was following me, but there was only darkness and the faint glow of my porch light. I never figured out who was driving that car or what their intentions were. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe it was road rage that never got unleashed. Maybe it was something else entirely. All I know is that during those long minutes on that pitch-black highway, I felt trapped and vulnerable. The memory stayed with me. Even now, I get a nervous jolt whenever I see a car tailgating me at night with their high beams on. I wonder if that moment in the gas station parking lot could have turned out differently if I'd made a different choice. But I did what I had to do, and in the end, nobody got hurt. I just learned to be more cautious on empty roads and to trust my instincts when something feels wrong. That's it. That's the story. No big climax or dramatic confrontation. Just a strange encounter with a driver who refused to pass, an unnerving few minutes at a lonely gas station, and a lot of adrenaline pumping through my veins. I don't lose sleep over it now. but I still remember the brightness of those high beams and the feeling of my heart pounding as I glanced in the rearview mirror, wondering if I would get home in one piece. I knew something was wrong the second I stepped inside my apartment. The air felt stale, like someone had been breathing it not long before I got home. My place usually smells like the dinner leftovers I toss in the kitchen trash, or the faint scent of the cleaning solution I use on weekends. That night, there was a trace of tobacco. I don't smoke, and I never let anyone smoke in my place. Right away, my stomach tightened. I felt my shoulders tense up, and I gripped my keys like they could protect me from whatever was going on. I closed the door behind me and locked it. It was around midnight, maybe a little after that. I had just come back from a business dinner that ran later than expected. I live alone in a 2-bedroom apartment in a relatively quiet building. Nothing fancy, just a decent place with a small living room connected to the kitchen by a short hallway, and a second bedroom I barely use except for storage. Usually, I enjoy the stillness when I come back from a long day. That night, I felt watched. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't catch my breath properly. I walked straight to the kitchen to put my keys on the counter where I always leave them. That's when I noticed a glass sitting at the far edge of the counter. It wasn't one of the glasses I normally keep in the drying rack. It was one of my older ones, and I had no memory of using it recently. I remember thinking that maybe I took it out at some point and forgot. But I'm careful about my routines. I like to keep things in order, especially in the kitchen. I always line up my glasses in the cabinet above the sink, and I don't leave them on the counter. I picked up the glass. It felt dusty on the outside, not like it had just been washed. The inside smelled faintly like water, but there was also this weird undertone I couldn't place, like stale air or something that had evaporated. It wasn't a strong smell, but it made me nervous. My skin started to crawl. I set the glass in the sink and wiped my hands on a dish towel. I kept looking around, half expecting to find more signs that someone had been in my apartment. The hallway light was off, which is normal because I never leave it on, but the switch felt warm when I touched it. I'm not an electrician, so maybe that was nothing. But it made me uneasy. My heart was already pounding, and that only made it worse. I walked through the apartment, checking every room. I turned on the lights in the living room first. Everything looked untouched. The couch was in place, the coffee table had my magazines scattered around the way I'd left them that morning, and the TV remote was on the arm of the couch. Then I checked the second bedroom, the one I barely use. I keep storage boxes in there, mostly old books, a few electronics I don't use anymore, and some extra linens. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance, but I still felt something was off. The window was closed, and there was no sign of forced entry. I flicked the light on and off, scanning each corner, even opened the closet door. Everything was stacked like it had been the last time I looked. After that, I turned off the light and moved on to my bedroom. I hesitated a second before opening the door. My hand was sweating. The doorknob felt damp against my palm. I pushed it open slowly and flicked on the light. My bed was messy the way I'd left it that morning, with the blankets half fallen on one side. A few shirts were tossed on a chair near the window. Nothing looked different or out of place, but I sensed some lingering warmth in the air, like someone had stood there not too long ago. I stood by the doorway for a solid minute, just listening. My breathing got louder in my own ears, and I realized how quiet the apartment was. No humming from the fridge, no buzzing from the lights, nothing. I only heard my own heartbeat and the mild hum of traffic from the street. After checking everywhere, I went back to the kitchen. The odor of tobacco was still present, but faint. I told myself it could have been a neighbor's smoke drifting in through a vent or something, though that had never happened before. Our building has strict rules against smoking in the hallways. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something else had happened. I decided to lock myself in my bedroom for the night. I couldn't do anything else without losing my mind to paranoia. I just wanted to be somewhere with a solid door and a decent lock. Inside my bedroom, I locked the door and checked it twice. I changed into sweatpants and an old t-shirt. Then I sat on my bed with my back against the headboard. I stared at the crack under the door, waiting for any movement or shadows. I put my phone on silent, but I kept the screen turned on, tapping it every time it started to dim. My idea was to keep a bit of light in the room. I didn't want to be in total darkness, because then every sound would spook me more. Around 1 a.m., I started to doze off against my will. My body was exhausted from the busy day and the stress. My eyes felt heavy, and my head kept nodding forward. I'd jerk awake at every small noise. The apartment building settles sometimes, and you get those random creaks in the walls or the floor. Normally I ignore them, but that night I clung to each one, waiting to see if it got louder. I felt my hands shake, and I had this uncomfortable knot in my gut. My throat was dry, and I regretted leaving the kitchen without a glass of water. Still, I couldn't bring myself to unlock the door and walk back out there. Sometime around 3 in the morning, I heard a distinct noise from the direction of the front door. It sounded like someone testing the door handle, moving it just enough to check if it was locked, but not enough to cause a rattle. The slight squeak was unmistakable. My body went cold. I felt my heart hammer so hard that my chest actually hurt. I sprang out of bed, my legs shaking so badly that I bumped into the nightstand. I stood there trying to decide if I should open my bedroom door or just call the police. My first instinct was to make sure no one was breaking in, but I didn't want to walk into a confrontation if there really was someone out there. I could barely think straight. I grabbed my phone. I pressed my ear against my bedroom door, listening hard. I heard nothing else. The building hallway can be dim at night, with only emergency lights on. I wondered if maybe the noise was just a neighbor coming home late or leaving. But the memory of the tobacco smell and the glass on the counter was too strong to dismiss. I felt sweat dripping down my temples. My throat felt like sandpaper. I forced myself to swallow a few times, but it didn't help. I decided to check. I unlocked my bedroom door as quietly as I could. I opened it just a crack and peered out. The hallway light was still off. I could see the living room curtains drawn shut. The main door at the end of the hallway was in shadow. I took a slow step out of my room, trying to keep my weight on my toes so the floor wouldn't squeak. My breathing was so loud in my ears that it felt like a drum beat. I took another step. Nothing moved. I had my phone in my left hand, ready to dial 911 if I saw something. When I got to the living room, I paused behind the couch to get a better angle on the front door. Through the peephole, I could see a thin strip of light from the hallway outside. It almost looked like the door wasn't fully closed, but it was. The latch was in place. I approached the door, taking small steps, staying low like that would help if someone was on the other side. When I reached it, I stood there, my heart pumping so fast it felt like a machine gun in my chest. I tried to look through the peephole, but my eye could only see the dim hallway. No movement, no shapes, nothing. I exhaled, not even realizing I had been holding my breath. I decided I'd flip the deadbolt even though I rarely use it. The second I touched it, I jumped. I thought I felt resistance from the other side, but it was probably just my nerves. I locked the deadbolt in the chain and then pressed my forehead against the cool wood of the door. My thoughts were jumbled. I felt silly for a moment, like maybe I was imagining everything. But the memory of that glass in the kitchen kept coming back, along with that stale smell of tobacco. I couldn't erase it. My body felt sore from the tension. My neck was stiff, and my hands had this slight tremor. I went back to my bedroom and locked the door again. I set my phone's alarm for 6 in the morning, deciding I would get up early, check the apartment in daylight, and consider calling a locksmith. I didn't sleep well, maybe got an hour of rest. Every time I started drifting off, I'd snap back awake at the smallest noise. A few times I caught myself holding my breath, listening for footsteps or creaking floorboards. When the alarm finally went off, I felt a wave of relief. The sun was starting to rise, so the bedroom wasn't so dark. I got out of bed, put on a pair of jeans and a sweatshirt, and grabbed the baseball bat I keep in my closet. I bought it years ago for exercise, but I rarely use it. That morning, I wanted it in my hands. My palms were clammy around the handle, and I kept tightening my grip. I unlocked the bedroom door and stepped out, scanning every inch of the hallway, the living room, the kitchen. Everything looked the same as the night before. I checked the front door. The deadbolt was still locked. The chain was still in place. No sign that anyone had tried to force it. I took a deep breath and decided to open the door to look out into the corridor. The hallway outside was lit by the weak morning light from the window at the end of the corridor. The building was quiet. No one was out there. I spotted a few shoe scuffs on the tile floor. They looked fresh, but it could have been any neighbor. I didn't see anything that told me who might have tested my door handle. Once I stepped back in, I locked the door again. I left the chain off for a second so I could open it quickly if needed. I walked into the kitchen and grabbed a water bottle from the fridge. I downed it in a few gulps, the cool liquid easing my scratchy throat. I tried to collect my thoughts. Part of me wanted to tear the place apart looking for any hidden clues. The other part of me wanted to leave for work early and forget about it. But I knew I couldn't ignore it. Someone had to have been in my apartment. That glass was definitely not a figment of my imagination. After I finished the water, I checked each window to make sure they were locked. I noticed that the bathroom window latch was slightly loose, but not broken. The window was closed, though. I pressed on it a few times to see if it would open easily. It didn't. I tried to check if there were any scratches around the lock or any sign of tampering. Nothing obvious. I got to the second bedroom and did a more thorough search. I moved the boxes around, opened a few of them. A couple had old VHS tapes and random junk. Nothing looked moved or disturbed. I checked the closet in that room again, pushing the jackets aside. Nothing. I spent a good 30 minutes going through every corner of the apartment, opening drawers, looking under the couch cushions, checking behind the shower curtain. I found no forced entry, no additional clues, but the paranoia wouldn't let me relax. Finally, I showered and got ready for work. While I was getting dressed, I tried to think of a logical explanation. Maybe I had left that glass out by accident. Maybe the tobacco smell was from someone in the hallway who lingered near my door, or maybe the vents carried it from another apartment. But none of that explained the door handle turning at 3 in the morning. I knew I'd heard it. I wasn't sleeping heavily enough to mistake that noise. Before leaving, I decided to call the building's management office. They opened at 9, so I waited until then. When I got someone on the phone, I asked if anyone had reported weird activity overnight. The person on the other end sounded bored and said they hadn't received any complaints. I asked if maintenance had been in my unit for any reason. They had no record of that. I mentioned I was concerned that someone might have a copy of my key. They suggested I contact a locksmith to change my locks. They didn't offer any other help. I ended up doing exactly that. I called a locksmith that afternoon and set up an appointment for the next day. My gut told me it was the right move. I didn't feel safe otherwise. For the rest of that day, my mind was stuck on the idea that a stranger had been in my apartment. I felt twitchy at work. I kept glancing at the clock, thinking about how my place was empty and unprotected. Every time my phone rang or buzzed, I jumped. My coworkers asked if I was feeling okay, and I just shrugged it off. I didn't want to explain that I was imagining a phantom intruder who left no trace except for a misplaced glass and a leftover smell of tobacco. That night I slept in my apartment again, but I used the deadbolt and the chain and even shoved a kitchen chair under the doorknob. I kept the baseball bat by my bed. I didn't hear anything suspicious that night, but I barely slept. Every creak made me tense up. My shoulders ached from the constant stress. My eyes stung from lack of proper rest. The next morning, the locksmith arrived. He changed both the front doorknob and the deadbolt. I asked him if it was possible for someone to have made a copy of my key without me knowing. He shrugged and said it was easy if they got their hands on the original even once. I'm still in that apartment. It's been a few weeks since that night. I haven't had any more strange occurrences, but I also don't feel fully relaxed. Sometimes I still think I smell that faint tobacco scent. Maybe it's in my head, or maybe someone is still out there, holding an old key that no longer works. Whenever I get home late, I stand in the hallway for a second before I unlock my door, listening. I haven't caught anyone lurking around, but I can't shake the feeling that someone was there and might come back. For now, I just keep my doors locked, my windows secure, and my eyes wide open.